Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I couldn't believe I'd said yes to this trip. The invitation from my old college roommate Terrence had arrived 3 weeks ago. A chance to reconnect with him and some friends from our past at a remote cabin in the Sentinel Pines area. 20 years had passed since our graduation, and while we'd managed to keep in sporadic contact, our lives had pulled us in different directions. Just the 6 of us, Terrence had written. The ultimate getaway. No cell service, no interruptions, just like the old days. Nostalgia is a potent drug. Despite my reservations about taking time away from my increasingly demanding job, I found myself driving along a winding mountain road on a crisp October afternoon in 2022. The autumn colors painted the landscape in brilliant reds and golds, but as I climbed higher into the mountains, the dense pines created tunnels of deep green shadow that swallowed the light. I checked the GPS one last time before the signal weakened. The blue dot of my location pulsed against the backdrop of unmarked forest roads, another 40 minutes according to the directions Terrence had included with his invitation. As I drove deeper into the wilderness, a sense of unease crept over me. The forest pressed in from both sides, branches scraping against my car windows like fingernails. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a rutted path. My sedan wasn't built for this terrain, and I winced at each jolt and scrape of the undercarriage. Just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd missed a turn, the trees parted to reveal a clearing. The cabin stood in the center, larger than I'd expected, its weathered timber exterior blending with the surrounding pines. 2 vehicles were already parked in front of it, Terrence's black SUV and a red pickup truck I didn't recognize. As I pulled up beside them, the cabin's front door swung open, and Terrence bounded down the steps, arms outstretched. "You made it!" he called, his familiar grin unchanged by the years. I was starting to worry. Reception's terrible up here. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. Almost turned back when I hit that excuse for a road. Terrence laughed, pulling me into a bear hug. "Worth it though, right? Look at this place." I had to admit the setting was spectacular. The cabin sat on a slight rise with the land sloping away behind it to reveal a panoramic view of the valley below. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Who else is here?" I asked, grabbing my duffel bag from the trunk. "Wesley and Isabel arrived about an hour ago. You remember them, they got married right after graduation, and we're still waiting on Thomas and Nora." The names triggered a flood of memories. Wesley, the pre-med student who'd always been the voice of reason in our group. Isabel, the brilliant art major who'd captured his heart. Thomas, our resident adventure seeker. And Nora, the quiet psychology major who'd always seemed to see right through everyone. "Come on in," Terrence said, leading the way. "We've already got the fire going." The cabin's interior was surprisingly spacious, with high ceilings supported by massive timber beams. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main living area, where Wesley and Isabel sat on a worn leather couch. They looked up as we entered, their faces lighting with recognition. "The gang's almost all here," Wesley said, rising to greet me. Isabel followed, her smile warm. "It's been too long." We exchanged the usual pleasantries, discussing jobs, relocations, mutual acquaintances, as Terrence showed me to my room. It was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking the dense forest behind the cabin. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said. "Kitchen's fully stocked. We're going to grill steaks tonight once Thomas and Nora arrive." He paused, leaning against the doorframe. "Thanks for coming. I know it was a long drive." "Wouldn't have missed it," I replied, though even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this reunion felt off. Maybe it was just the isolation or the strange acoustics of the cabin that seemed to swallow our voices. "Get settled in," Terrence said. "We'll be in the living room." As he closed the door, I set my bag on the bed and moved to the window. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the trees. From this angle, I couldn't see the road or the other vehicles, just an endless expanse of pines stretching toward the horizon. I unpacked quickly, then paused before rejoining the others. On impulse, I checked my phone. No service as expected. I was completely cut off from the outside world. With a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room, familiar and comforting. Yet as I walked toward my old friends, I couldn't escape the nagging sensation that I was being watched. Not by them, but by something in the surrounding forest. Something that had been waiting for our arrival. Dinner stretched well past sunset. Thomas and Nora had arrived just before dusk, completing our group of 6. After the initial flurry of reunions and reminiscences, we'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm, as though the intervening decades had compressed into nothing. Terrence had outdone himself with the meal. The steaks were perfect, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation drifted from shared memories to current lives and back again. Sitting around the large wooden dining table, watching firelight dance across the faces of my old friends, I began to relax. Perhaps my earlier unease had been nothing more than travel fatigue. "Remember that time we all went camping at Lake Merrill?" Thomas asked, refilling his glass. Age had added silver to his temples, but his eyes still held the same adventurous gleam I remembered from college. "How could I forget?" Wesley groaned. "You assured us it was just a short hike to the campsite." 7 miles, Isabel added, laughing. "With full packs." "Worth it for that view, though," Nora said quietly. She'd always been the introspective one of our group, speaking less but observing more. Time had etched fine lines around her eyes, but her gaze remained as penetrating as ever. "This place reminds me of it," Terrence said, gesturing around the cabin. Same feeling of being completely removed from everything. Something in his tone made me look up sharply. There was an odd intensity to his expression, quickly masked behind another smile as he caught my eye. "How did you find this place anyway?" I asked. A momentary silence fell over the table. "Family connection," Terrence replied after a beat. "Distant cousin owns it. Barely uses it himself, especially in the off-season." "Lucky for us," Thomas said, raising his glass in a toast. "To old friends and new adventures." We all echoed the sentiment, but as I sipped my wine, I noticed Isabel exchange a quick glance with Wesley. Something unspoken passed between them. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and Terrence busied himself adding more logs while the rest of us settled into various chairs and couches. The cabin creaked and shifted around us, old timber adjusting to the dropping temperature outside. "Do you hear that?" Nora asked suddenly, her head tilted toward the windows. We all fell silent, listening. "I don't hear anything," Wesley said after a moment. "Exactly," Nora replied. "No birds, no insects, nothing." She was right. Beyond the crackling of the fire, the cabin was enveloped in an unnatural silence. In the city, I'd grown accustomed to constant background noise. Traffic, neighbors, the hum of electronics. Here, the absence of sound was almost deafening. "It's just the elevation and the time of year," Terrence said dismissively. "Most wildlife is already hunkering down for winter." "Still," Nora persisted, "doesn't it seem strange? Even at night, there should be some sounds." "Maybe they sense something we don't," Thomas suggested with a theatrical wiggle of his eyebrows. "Maybe this place is—" "Let's not start with ghost stories on the first night," Isabel interrupted, her voice sharper than the casual conversation warranted. Another strange silence descended, broken only when Terrence stood up abruptly. "Drinks, I almost forgot. I've got some excellent scotch in the kitchen." As he disappeared down the hallway, I caught Thomas watching me. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "You seem tense." I forced a smile. "Just tired from the drive, and maybe a little disoriented by being so disconnected." He nodded sympathetically. "I know what you mean. I checked earlier. There's not even a landline here. Complete digital detox." "Terrence didn't mention that in the invitation," I said. "Would you have come if he had?" Thomas asked, his expression unreadable. Before I could answer, a crash from the kitchen made us all jump. We heard Terrence curse, followed by the sound of glass being swept up. "Everything okay in there?" Wesley called. "All good," Terrence shouted back. "Just dropped a glass. Watch your step coming in here. I might have missed some shards." The interruption broke the moment and conversation gradually resumed, though I noticed it stayed carefully on safe topics. Jobs, children, mutual acquaintances. No one mentioned the strange silence outside or the palpable tension that had briefly surfaced. Later, as we were all preparing to turn in for the night, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Isabel. She was rinsing glasses at the sink, her back to me as I entered. "Need help?" I offered. She started slightly, then shook her head. "Almost done." After a pause, she added, "I'm glad you could make it. It wouldn't have been the same without you." "Wouldn't have missed it," I said, repeating what I'd told Terrence earlier. This time, the words felt even less convincing. Isabel turned off the water and dried her hand, still not meeting my eyes. "Listen," she said in a low voice, "if anything unusual happens while we're here, stick close to Wesley and me." "Okay?" I stared at her. "What do you mean, unusual?" She finally looked at me, her expression conflicted. "Probably nothing, just be aware of your surroundings." Before I could press her further, Wesley appeared in the doorway. "Ready for bed, Iz?" She nodded, giving my arm a quick squeeze as she passed. "Good night. Sleep well." I remained in the kitchen for several minutes after they left, trying to make sense of Isabel's cryptic warning. Through the window above the sink, I could see nothing but my own reflection against a backdrop of impenetrable darkness. The forest had vanished into the night, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was pressing closer to the cabin, watching, waiting. When I finally headed to my room, the hallway seemed longer and darker than I remembered. The sounds of the others preparing for bed gradually faded, replaced by the subtle creaks and groans of the cabin settling. I closed my bedroom door, testing the lock twice before preparing for sleep. Despite my exhaustion, I lay awake for hours listening to the silence. Just as I was finally drifting off, a sound penetrated my consciousness. A long, low scratching along the outer wall, like branches dragging across the wood. Except there were no trees close enough to the cabin to touch its walls. I pulled the covers tighter and told myself it was just the wind. I awoke to diffuse sunlight filtering through the curtains. For a disorienting moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The unfamiliar smell of pine and old wood, the too firm mattress beneath me, the absolute stillness. Then it all rushed back. The cabin, my friends, Isabel's strange warning. My watch showed 7:42 a.m. I'd slept later than intended, though my rest had been fitful at best. Dreams had plagued me throughout the night. Vague impressions of being pursued through endless trees, of searching for something vital I couldn't name. Pulling on sweatpants and a hoodie against the morning chill, I stepped into the hallway. The cabin was quiet, but I could smell coffee brewing. I followed the scent to the kitchen, where I found Wesley already dressed and reading a paperback at the table. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Coffee's fresh. Everyone else is still asleep, I think." I poured myself a cup and joined him. "Early riser?" "Old habits," he shrugged. "Hospital schedules don't leave much room for sleeping in, even after retirement." We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the steam from our mugs creating ghostly patterns in the sunlight. "Did you sleep okay?" Wesley asked eventually, closing his book. "Not really," I admitted. "Kept hearing strange noises." He nodded, unsurprised. "Old cabins make all kinds of sounds. Wood expanding and contracting with the temperature changes." "It wasn't just that." I hesitated, then decided to be direct. "Isabel said something odd to me last night. Something about sticking close to you two if anything unusual happens." Wesley's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did she elaborate?" "No, but between that and the weird tension at dinner," I leaned forward. "What's going on, Wes? Why are we really here?" He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "It's complicated, and not entirely my story to tell. Try me. We've known each other for over 20 years. "That's just it," he said quietly. "We have history. Good history, mostly. But there are things about that last year. Things you might not remember clearly." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept up my spine. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Wesley straightened, his face smoothing into a neutral expression as Terrence appeared in the doorway. "Morning, campers," Terrence said with forced cheer. "Sleep well?" "Like a log," Wesley replied, not meeting my eyes. "Just catching up with our friend here." Terrence moved to the coffee pot, his back to us, as he poured himself a cup. "Perfect day for a hike, don't you think? I thought we could explore some of the trails around the property after breakfast." "Sounds good," I said automatically. though my mind was racing with questions about Wesley's cryptic statements. Great. I'll start on breakfast once the others are up. Terrence turned, leaning against the counter as he sipped his coffee. His eyes darted between Wesley and me, assessing. Everything okay? Just fine, Wesley said, standing. Think I'll grab a shower before the hot water gets claimed. As he left, an awkward silence filled the kitchen. Terrence watched me over the rim of his mug, his expression unreadable. You seem tense, he observed, finally. Just adjusting to being unplugged, I replied, attempting a casual tone. It's been a while since I've been this disconnected from the world. Terrence smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's the whole point, isn't it? To get away from all that noise and remember what's important. And what's that? Friendship, loyalty? His smile faded. Accountability. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. Before I could respond, the sound of more footsteps approaching saved me from having to reply. Thomas and Nora entered together, mid-conversation. They paused when they saw us, and I couldn't help noticing how Nora's eyes darted around the room, as if checking for something, or someone. Morning, Thomas said, too brightly. What's the plan for today? Hiking after breakfast, Terrence replied, his demeanor shifting instantly to affable host. There's a great lookout point about 2 miles from here. The next hour passed in a blur of mundane morning activities. Showers, breakfast preparation, casual conversation carefully steered toward safe topics. Isabel joined us last, her eyes finding mine across the room with a question I couldn't answer. By mid-morning, we were all gathered in the living room, dressed for hiking. Terrence distributed water bottles and trail maps he'd printed before our arrival. We'll take the North Trail, he explained, pointing to a dotted line on the map. It's about 2 miles to the overlook. Moderate difficulty, but nothing too strenuous. Will we be back by dark? Nora asked, zipping up her jacket. Easily, Terrence assured her. As long as we don't dawdle. As we filed out of the cabin, I found myself walking beside Isabel. Can we talk? I murmured. She glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. Not here, not yet. Just stay alert today. For what? She shook her head slightly. You'll understand soon enough. Terrence has a purpose for this weekend. Before I could press further, Wesley fell into step beside us, effectively ending the conversation. I noticed he kept a protective proximity to Isabel, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. The trail started innocuously enough, a well-maintained path winding through tall pines. The morning air was crisp and clean, the forest floor carpeted with fallen needles that muffled our footsteps. Under different circumstances, I might have enjoyed the hike, the physical exertion, the breathtaking scenery. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every rustle in the underbrush made me tense. Every shadow seemed to harbor some unseen threat. And beneath it all ran a current of dread, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. About an hour into the hike, Terrence, who had been leading our single-file procession, stopped abruptly. Water break, he announced, though none of us had requested one. As we gathered in a small clearing, I noticed we'd veered off the marked trail. The path behind us was barely visible, obscured by dense foliage. Where exactly are we? Thomas asked, voicing my own concern. Just a slight detour, Terrence replied easily. There's something I want to show you all. The overlook? Nora questioned, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. Something better. Terrence's smile didn't reach his eyes. Something you all need to see. A heavy silence fell over our group. I looked at each of my friends in turn, trying to read their expressions. Wesley and Isabel stood close together, their postures tense but resigned. Thomas fidgeted with his water bottle, avoiding eye contact. Nora alone met my gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and... was that guilt? What's going on? I demanded, looking directly at Terrence. What is this really about? He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. Memory's a funny thing, isn't it? Selective. Protective, even. He gestured to the others. Ask them. Ask them what happened during spring break of our senior year. I looked around the circle, confusion giving way to a creeping unease. We went to Myrtle Beach, all of us, plus I stopped, frowning. There had been someone else with us on that trip, hadn't there? But the memory was hazy, indistinct. Plus who? Terrence pressed, his voice soft but insistent. I don't... I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. It was a long time ago. Not too long to remember, Bryce, Wesley said quietly. The name hit me like a physical blow. Bryce. How could I have forgotten Bryce? Images flashed through my mind. A tall, lanky figure with an easy laugh. Late-night study sessions. Heated debates about philosophy and politics. He'd been part of our circle, though always somewhat on the periphery. Bryce, I repeated slowly. He was with us at Myrtle Beach, but then... I frowned, trying to piece together fragments of memory. He transferred to another school, didn't he? After spring break? The silence that greeted this statement was deafening. Terrence's expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. A cold, implacable judgment. He didn't transfer, he said flatly. He disappeared. And we all know why. What do you mean, disappeared? I asked, though a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach suggested I already knew the answer. Terrence's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. Oh, that's rich. Playing dumb after all these years. I'm not playing anything, I insisted. I remember Bryce was with us at Myrtle Beach, but after that, I trailed off, searching my memories. They seemed strangely elusive, as if viewed through frosted glass. After that, Terrence continued relentlessly. There was the bonfire on the beach, the drinking, the argument. Fragments began to surface, flashes of firelight on water, the taste of cheap beer, raised voices cutting through music and laughter. We were all there, Wesley said quietly. All of us. And we all played a part in what happened next. No, I shook my head even as more memories began to coalesce. There was an argument, yes. Bryce was drunk, belligerent. He stormed off. And? Terrence prompted, his eyes never leaving my face. And we let him go, I finished lamely. He was supposed to cool off, come back when he'd sobered up. But he never came back, Nora whispered, hugging herself as if cold despite the warming day. We waited all night. And then we made a decision, Thomas cut in, his voice uncharacteristically harsh. A pact. The word triggered a flood of memories so vivid they staggered me. The 5 of them gathered in our rented beach house, faces grave in the gray dawn light, whispered arguments. Isabel crying. Wesley, always the pragmatist, laying out the options. And me? Where had I been during this discussion? I wasn't part of any pact, I said slowly, looking from face to face. I was out looking for him. I spent hours searching the beach, the boardwalk. Convenient, Terrence scoffed. You always were good at distancing yourself when things got messy. What exactly are you accusing me of? Not just you, Isabel interjected, her voice strained. All of us. We all share responsibility for what happened. Which was what exactly? I demanded, frustration mounting. Bryce was drunk. He wandered off. If something happened to him after that, how is that on us? A terrible silence followed my question. Wesley and Isabel exchanged glances. Thomas looked away, his jaw tight. Nora stared at the ground, motionless. Terrence alone held my gaze, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. You really don't remember, do you? He asked finally. Or have you just gotten so good at lying to yourself that you believe your own fiction? Before I could respond, he turned abruptly and began walking deeper into the forest, away from the path. Come on, he called over his shoulder. It's time you saw for yourself. The others followed without hesitation, leaving me little choice but to join them. We pushed through dense underbrush, the trail completely vanished now. Pine needles gave way to rocky soil as we climbed a gentle slope. No one spoke. The only sounds our labored breathing and the occasional snap of branches underfoot. After about 20 minutes, Terrence stopped at the base of a massive pine. Its trunk was scarred with old lightning strikes, its bark blackened on one side. Beside it, partially concealed by fallen branches and years of forest detritus, was a small clearing. Here, Terrence said simply, gesturing to the ground. I looked around in confusion. What am I supposed to be seeing? Wordlessly, Wesley moved forward and began clearing away the debris, revealing disturbed soil beneath. The earth was different here, darker, compacted. Horror dawned slowly as I realized what I was looking at. No, I breathed. That's not possible. We buried him here, Thomas said, his voice hollow. All of us. 20 years ago. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Buried? But that would mean... He's dead, Nora finished flatly. Has been since that night. No, I shook my head vehemently. Bryce stormed off. He was angry, but he was alive when I last saw him. When you last saw him, Terrence repeated, emphasizing each word. And when was that exactly? I closed my eyes, trying to order my chaotic thoughts. The bonfire. The argument. Something about Isabel, about inappropriate advances. Bryce drunk and belligerent, shouting accusations. Then me following him away from the group, trying to calm him down. And then, a yawning void where memory should be. I don't know, I admitted finally, opening my eyes to find them all watching me. I remember following him down the beach, but after that, Wesley said quietly, you came back to the house alone. Hours later, covered in sand and other things. Blood, Isabel supplied, her voice barely audible. Your clothes had blood on them. I stared at her in shock. That's not possible. You said there had been an accident, Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving mine. You said Bryce had fallen on the rocks by the jetty, hit his head. You said he was gone. No, I whispered, though the certainty in their faces made my denial sound hollow even to my own ears. Yes, Terrence insisted. You told us he was dead and we needed to protect each other. That no one would believe it was an accident. Not with the argument everyone had witnessed, not with your history of conflict with him. My history? I echoed, bewildered. Don't play innocent, Terrence snapped. Everyone knew you hated him after he and Catherine broke up. You blamed him for her dropping out, for her... He cut himself off abruptly. Catherine, another name that sent shockwaves through my carefully constructed reality. Catherine, my first serious girlfriend. Catherine, who had indeed left school abruptly our junior year, after a brief relationship with Bryce. Catherine, who I hadn't allowed myself to think about in years. This is insane, I managed, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. I couldn't have... We helped you, Nora said, tears now streaming down her face. God help us, we all helped you. We drove out here that night to this exact spot. Terrence knew about it from a hunting trip with his father. Remote, rarely visited. We buried him, Wesley confirmed, his clinical detachment more disturbing than Nora's emotion. Wrapped him in a tarp from my parents' garage, dug as deep as we could with the tools we had. And then we made a pact, Isabel concluded, never to speak of it again to anyone, to support the story that Bryce had simply transferred schools after spring break. I sank to my knees, the ground seeming to sway beneath me. Their words rang with terrible authenticity, yet I had no memory of any of it. The body, the burial, the pact. How could I have forgotten something so monumental? If what you're saying is true, I said finally, why bring it up now? After 20 years? Terrence crouched beside me, his expression grim. Because it's time to make things right. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet around us, as if the trees themselves were listening. I remained on my knees, trying to reconcile their horrific account with the gaps in my memory. Make things right? I repeated, looking up at Terrence. What does that even mean after all this time? It means confession, he replied steadily. To the authorities, all of us together. I stared at him in disbelief. You brought us to a remote cabin with no communication to tell us we're all going to prison? Not all of us, Thomas clarified, his voice tight. Just the person responsible for Bryce's death. 5 pairs of eyes fixed on me, their meaning unmistakable. This is insane, I said again, struggling to my feet. I didn't kill anyone, and I certainly don't remember burying a body here or anywhere else. Convenient amnesia, Terrence remarked coldly. Or maybe, I countered, anger finally breaking through my shock. There's nothing to remember because it didn't happen the way you're saying. Wesley stepped forward, his medical training evident in his measured tone. Memory suppression is a documented psychological response to trauma. You may have genuinely blocked the events of that night. Or, I suggested, looking each of them in the eye, one of you is lying. Maybe all of you. A tense silence followed my accusation. I noticed subtle exchanges of glances between them. Isabel to Wesley, Thomas to Nora, all of them to Terrence, who seemed to be the orchestrator of this macabre reunion. Why would we lie about this? Nora asked, sounding genuinely bewildered. I don't know, I admitted, but something doesn't add up. If Bryce is really buried here, if I really killed him, why wait 20 years to confront me? Why the elaborate setup? Because of Catherine, Terrence said quietly. That name again. A sharp pain lanced through my temples at its mention. What about her? I asked warily. She killed herself last month, Isabel said, her voice breaking. Overdose. She left a note, mentioning Bryce. My knees threatened to buckle again. Catherine is dead? You didn't know? Wesley asked, watching me closely. How would I? We haven't spoken since college, but even as I said it, fragments of memory contested this claim. A late-night phone call years ago, Catherine's voice slurred and desperate, accusations I'd hung up on rather than hear. Her note suggested she knew something about Bryce's disappearance, Terrence continued. Something she'd been carrying all these years. The police reopened the missing persons case. They've been interviewing people from our class. Cold fear washed over me. And you thought what? That you'd get ahead of the investigation by extracting a confession? We thought, Wesley said carefully, that after 20 years the truth deserved to come out. For Bryce's family. For Catherine. For all of us who've been living with this shadow. I looked around at their faces, these people who had once been my closest friends, now strangers united against me. Or were they? Doubt gnawed at me. Could I really have done what they described and blocked it so completely from my memory? If Bryce is buried here, I said slowly, dig him up. Prove it to me. A heavy silence met my challenge. We don't have the proper tools, Thomas said finally. Convenient, I echoed Terrence's earlier accusation. So I'm just supposed to take your word for it? Confess to a murder I have no memory of committing? We're not asking for an immediate confession, Terrence said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just reflection, honesty, the chance to face this together before the police come to their own conclusions. And if I refuse? If I walk away right now, head back to the cabin and drive home? The authorities already have an anonymous tip about this location, Wesley said quietly. If you leave, they'll find you. The implicit threat hung in the air between us. I studied each of their faces, looking for cracks in their unified front. Isabel wouldn't meet my eyes. Thomas fidgeted nervously. Nora seemed on the verge of tears again. Wesley remained clinical and detached. Only Terrence returned my gaze steadily, his expression unreadable. Well then, I said finally, it seems I have no choice but to stay. But I'm not confessing to anything. Terrence nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. Let's head back to the cabin. It'll be dark soon. As we retraced our steps through the forest, I hung back, watching the others. They moved as a group, occasionally murmuring to each other while maintaining a careful distance from me. I felt like a dangerous animal they'd corralled but couldn't quite control. The walk back seemed longer, the forest darker despite the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy. Shadows stretched across our path, and more than once I caught myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see a figure watching us. Bryce's ghost, perhaps, or just my own guilt personified. But was it guilt I felt, or simply the disorientation of having my reality so fundamentally challenged? By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. Terrence unlocked the door and we filed inside, the warmth a stark contrast to the growing chill outside. No one spoke as we removed jackets and boots, the tension palpable. I'll start dinner, Isabel announced, breaking the silence. Her voice was too bright, too normal, as if we hadn't just stood over an alleged grave. I'll help, Nora offered quickly, following her into the kitchen. Thomas disappeared to use the bathroom. Wesley settled in an armchair with his book, though I noticed his eyes never moved across the page. Terrence remained by the door, watching me with that same unreadable expression. What happens now? I asked him quietly. We wait, he replied. For what? My conscience to miraculously produce memories I don't have. His smile was thin, for the truth to emerge. One way or another, dinner was a stilted affair. We sat around the table, the same configuration as the previous night, but now the casual conversation had been replaced by weighted silences and careful small talk. Isabel had prepared a pasta dish that no one seemed particularly interested in eating. Forks pushed food around plates. Wine glasses were refilled with increasing frequency. I couldn't stop watching them, These people I'd once trusted implicitly. Were they truly convinced of my guilt, or was something else at play? The accusation seemed too coordinated, too rehearsed. And yet the gaps in my memory troubled me. What if they were right? "You're quiet," Terrence observed, breaking a prolonged silence. I met his gaze across the table, just trying to make sense of everything. "Any progress?" His tone was almost conversational, as if he were asking about a difficult crossword puzzle rather than a decades-old alleged murder. "Some," I replied carefully. "I've been thinking about that spring break, about Bryce. 5 pairs of eyes fixed on me with varying degrees of intensity." "And?" Wesley prompted. "And I remember more than I let on earlier." This wasn't entirely a lie. Throughout the afternoon, fragments had been surfacing, disjointed scenes, snippets of conversation, sensations. "Such as?" Terrence leaned forward slightly. "I remember following Bryce down the beach after the argument. He was furious, ranting about Isabel rejecting him, about all of us taking her side. I paused, watching Isabel's reaction. She lowered her eyes, confirmation enough. "Go on," Terrence urged. We reached the jetty. The rocks were slippery from the tide. We argued more. I closed my eyes, trying to capture the elusive memory. He shoved me. I pushed back, then I opened my eyes. Nothing. The next clear memory I have is walking back to the beach house alone. "Convenient," Thomas muttered. "But not unusual," Wesley countered, his clinical detachment returning. "The mind often blocks traumatic events. Or fabricates false memories to fill gaps," I suggested. "How can any of us be certain what really happened that night? It was 20 years ago. We were all drunk, emotional." "We didn't all come back covered in blood," Nora said quietly. "So you say," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "But I only have your word for that. Just like you only have Terrence's word that he found this spot for us to bury a body I supposedly killed." A subtle tension rippled through the group. I caught another exchange of glances between Thomas and Nora. "Are you suggesting we're lying?" Terrence asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I'm suggesting that memory is unreliable, that perhaps we've all constructed narratives about that night that serve our own needs." I set down my fork deliberately. "And I'm wondering why, after 20 years of silence, you've orchestrated this confrontation now." "We told you, Catherine's suicide note," Isabel began. "Yes, Catherine. Another convenient piece of this puzzle who can't speak for herself." I looked around the table. "Did any of you actually see this note? Or are we taking Terrence's word for that too?" Wesley and Isabel exchanged glances. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Nora looked down at her plate. Only Terrence maintained his composure. "You think I made this up?" "To what end?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out," I admitted. "What possible motive could you have for concocting such an elaborate scenario?" "Maybe because it's the truth," he said simply. "Or maybe," I countered, "there's something else going on here. Something you're not telling me." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of an old clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, transforming the windows into black mirrors that reflected our tense gathering. "What happened between you and Bryce?" I asked suddenly, looking directly at Terrence. "Before spring break, there was something, wasn't there?" A muscle twitched in Terrence's jaw, the first crack in his composure I'd seen. "This isn't about me, isn't it? You arranged this whole weekend. You led us to that so-called grave. You seem the most invested in my confession." "Because I was there," Terrence snapped, emotion finally breaking through. "I helped carry the body. I helped dig the hole. I've lived with that decision every day for 20 years. "We all have," Isabel added softly. "Have you?" I challenged. "Or have you lived with a story you collectively created? A narrative that absolved you of whatever really happened that night?" "That's enough," Wesley said sharply. "This isn't getting us anywhere." "On the contrary," I replied. "I think we're finally getting somewhere interesting." I turned back to Terrence. "Bryce knew something about you, didn't he? Something you didn't want revealed." Terrence's face had gone pale. "You're delusional." "Am I? Then why did you really bring us here? What's the actual plan, Terrence?" "Because I don't believe for a second it's about clearing anyone's conscience." The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Wesley placed a restraining hand on Terrence's arm, while Isabel looked between us with growing alarm. "I think," Thomas interjected carefully, "we should all take a step back. It's been an emotional day. Maybe we should continue this discussion tomorrow." "Fine," Terrence said abruptly, pushing back from the table. "Tomorrow, when we've all had time to reflect." He fixed me with a cold stare. "Including you." He left the kitchen without another word, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floors. After a moment's hesitation, Nora followed him. An uncomfortable silence descended on those of us remaining. I looked at the three faces across from me, Wesley, Isabel, Thomas, searching for any sign that my accusations had struck a nerve. "He's not wrong, you know," Wesley said finally. "About the psychological impact of trauma. Memory suppression is real. So is manipulation," I replied, "and false memory syndrome." "What do you think happened that night?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I don't know. But I'm becoming increasingly convinced that whatever occurred, the story you've all accepted isn't the full truth." "And what makes you so certain?" Thomas challenged. "Because none of this makes sense," I said bluntly. "If I killed Bryce, if we all conspired to hide his body, why would Terrence risk exposing that now? Why bring us to the actual burial site? Why not just go to the police if his conscience was really bothering him?" No one had an answer to that. "I'm going to get some air," I announced, standing up. "Don't worry, I'm not running. I just need to think." None of them moved to stop me as I grabbed my jacket and headed for the front door. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp in my lungs. Stars pierced the blackness above, unnaturally bright without the competition of city lights. The forest surrounding the cabin was a wall of deeper darkness, impenetrable to the eye. I walked a short distance to a rough-hewn bench positioned to overlook the valley. Though at night there was nothing to see but blackness, sitting down I tried to order my chaotic thoughts to separate memory from suggestion, fact from fear. Had I killed Bryce? The possibility sickened me, yet I couldn't dismiss it entirely. The gaps in my memory were real, the flashes of that night on the beach tantalizing in their incompleteness. But something about the other's unified narrative felt wrong, too polished, too certain after so many years. The sound of footsteps on pine needles alerted me to another presence. I tensed, half expecting Terrence, but it was Nora who emerged from the shadows, her figure silhouetted against the faint light from the cabin windows. "Mind if I join you?" she asked hesitantly. I gestured to the empty space beside me. She sat, keeping a careful distance between us. For several minutes we sat in silence, our breath fogging in the cold air. Finally she spoke, her voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "I don't think you killed Bryce." I turned to look at her, but her face was in shadow. "What makes you say that?" "Because I saw him after your argument on the beach." The words rushed out of her as if she'd been holding them back for years. "After you walked away." My heart began to pound. "You saw him alive?" She nodded, a barely perceptible movement in the darkness. "He was drunk, angry, but very much alive. He was heading back toward the boardwalk when I ran into him." "Did you tell the others this?" "I tried to, the next morning when you came back talking about an accident. But Terrence, he convinced everyone it was better this way, that we needed to protect you. Protect all of us, but why?" I pressed. "If Bryce was alive when you saw him—" "I don't know," she interrupted. "I've asked myself that question for 20 years. At first I thought maybe Terrence encountered Bryce later that night after I saw him. That maybe Terrence was the one who—" She trailed off. "Who actually killed him," I finished for her. She nodded again. "But lately I've been wondering if Bryce died at all. If any of this is real." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept up my spine. "What do you mean?" Nora turned to face me, her features becoming visible as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. "Don't you think it's strange that none of us have mentioned Bryce in all these years? That we've barely stayed in contact despite supposedly sharing such a devastating secret?" "Memory suppression," I suggested, echoing Wesley's earlier explanation. "Or something else," she countered. "Something happened that night, yes. But I'm not convinced anymore that it was what Terrence says." "Then why go along with this charade?" She looked away. "Because I was afraid not to. Because Terrence can be persuasive. And because part of me thought that if we all came back here to this place, the truth would finally come out." "And has it?" "I don't know," she admitted. But I do know that I don't believe you're a killer, and I don't think you should confess to something you have no memory of doing." Her words should have been reassuring, but instead they only deepened my unease. If Nora was right, if Bryce had been alive after my encounter with him, then what was this weekend really about? What was Terrence's endgame? Before I could press her further, the cabin door opened, spilling light across the clearing. Thomas stood in the doorway, his silhouette elongated by the angle of the light. "Everything okay out here?" he called, his tone casual but his posture alert. "Fine," Nora replied quickly, standing up. "Just getting some fresh air." "Well, it's getting late," Thomas said. "And cold. Better come in." As Nora moved toward the cabin, she paused beside me. "Be careful," she whispered. "Don't drink anything Terrence gives you." Then she was gone, walking swiftly to join Thomas at the door. I remained on the bench, her warning echoing in my mind, adding another layer to my growing suspicion that nothing about this reunion was what it seemed. When I finally returned to the cabin, the main living area was deserted. Dishes had been cleared, lights dimmed. From behind closed bedroom doors came muffled voices, Wesley and Isabel in murmured conversation, Terrence and Thomas in what sounded like heated disagreement. Only Nora's door was silent. As I passed it on the way to my own room, I noticed it was slightly ajar, a thin line of light visible at the threshold. I hesitated, then continued to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep seemed impossible given the circumstances, yet exhaustion pulled at me. I lay on the bed fully clothed, mind racing through scenarios, trying to piece together the fragments of that long-ago night with the strange dynamics of the present. Just as I was drifting into an uneasy doze, a soft knock at my door jerked me back to alertness. "Who is it?" I called softly. "Isabel," came the whispered reply. "Please, I need to talk to you." Cautiously, I unlocked the door. Isabel stood in the hallway, a folded piece of paper clutched in her hand, her expression one of barely contained panic. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting the paper toward me. I found it in Terrence's bag when I was looking for aspirin. I unfolded the paper, revealing what appeared to be a typed itinerary. Friday, arrival. Dinner, initial conversation. Saturday, hike to site, confrontation. Sunday, securing confession, chemical assist if necessary. Monday, departure to predetermined location. The last line was followed by a series of coordinates. "What is this?" I asked, though the implications were chillingly clear. "I think," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling, "that Terrence never intended for any of us to leave this cabin alive." Isabel's words hung in the air between us, their weight nearly tangible. I pulled her into my room and closed the door, my mind struggling to process the implications of what she'd shown me. "Explain," I demanded in a harsh whisper. She sank onto the edge of the bed, hands trembling. "I've been having doubts about this whole thing from the start. The story about Catherine's suicide note, it didn't add up. I tried calling her parents after Terrence told us, but they hadn't heard anything about a note mentioning Bryce. So Terrence lied, I said. The confirmation both shocking and strangely vindicating. About that, yes. But I don't know how much else is fabricated." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "What if Bryce really is buried out there? What if Terrence actually killed him and has been planning this elaborate setup to frame you all these years?" The possibility sent a chill through me. "But why wait 20 years? And why involve all of you?" "Loose ends," she suggested grimly. "We all knew something happened that night, even if our memories differ on the details. Maybe Terrence decided it was time to eliminate everyone who could contradict his version of events. Chemical assist," I quoted from the paper, thinking of Nora's warning not to accept drinks from Terrence. "He was planning to drug us." "Or worse," Isabel said softly. "The coordinates at the bottom, I checked them on my phone before we lost service. They're for a remote area about 30 miles from here, even more isolated than this cabin." My mind raced through the implications. If Terrence had arranged this weekend to eliminate witnesses to something that happened 20 years ago, we were in immediate danger. "We need to leave," I decided. "Now. All of us except Terrence." "Wesley won't go without proof," Isabel said, shaking her head. "He trusts Terrence implicitly. They've stayed close over the years, unlike the rest of us. Then we show him this. I held up the paper. It won't be enough. Terrence will claim it's something else, some innocent explanation, and Wesley will believe him. What about Thomas and Nora? Isabel hesitated. Thomas has been acting strangely since we arrived. Jumpy, secretive. I'm not sure we can trust him. Nora might be our best ally. She's always been perceptive. She already suspects something. I told Isabel about my conversation with Nora outside. She says she saw Bryce alive after my argument with him. Isabel's eyes widened. She never told me that. She says she tried to tell everyone the next morning, but Terrence convinced you all it was better to stick to the story that I'd killed Bryce. That's not how I remember it. Isabel frowned. The next morning you came back to the house covered in blood, talking about an accident on the rocks. Terrence and Wesley went to check the spot you described, came back saying they'd found Bryce's body. I stared at her. I don't remember any of that. See? This is what's so maddening. We all have different versions of that night, that morning. How do we know which is real? A disturbing thought occurred to me. What if none of them are? What if Terrence has been manipulating our memories all these years, feeding us versions of events that support his narrative whenever we've been in contact? Is that even possible? I don't know. But something isn't right here. I paced the small room, trying to think clearly despite the mounting fear. We need to get out of here tonight, whether the others come or not. The keys to all the vehicles are in a bowl by the front door, Isabel said. But Terrence's room is right off the living area. He'll hear us if we try to leave. Then we wait until he's asleep. Keep packing minimal, just essentials. We'll take my car. It's parked closest to the road. Isabel nodded, standing up. I'll talk to Nora, see if she'll come with us. But carefully. I don't want to alert Thomas if he's working with Terrence. As she reached for the door, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. We both froze, holding our breath. After a moment of silence, Isabel cautiously opened the door a crack, peering out. No one there, she whispered. But we should be careful. Meet me in the kitchen at 2 a.m. Everyone should be asleep by then. I nodded and she slipped out, closing the door behind her. I immediately locked it, then moved to the window, considering it as a potential escape route if needed. It was small but might be manageable in an emergency. The next few hours were excruciating. I sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, listening to the sounds of the cabin as the others retired for the night. Muffled conversations, footsteps, the occasional creak of floorboards. Finally, around midnight, silence descended. I waited, checking my watch obsessively as the minutes crawled by. At 1:45 a.m., I gathered my phone, wallet, and jacket, the only essentials I needed. Carefully, I unlocked my door and eased it open, wincing at the slight creak of the hinges. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by a faint light coming from the kitchen. Moving silently, I made my way toward it, every sense heightened, alert for any sound or movement. The kitchen was empty when I arrived, the dim light coming from a small lamp on the counter that someone had left on. I checked my watch again. 1:52 a.m. Isabel should arrive any minute, hopefully with Nora. I moved to the front door, locating the bowl of keys Isabel had mentioned. My own car keys were there, along with what I assumed were Terrence's and Thomas's. I pocketed mine, then returned to the kitchen to wait. No sign of Isabel. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the cabin. Still alone in the kitchen, my anxiety mounting with each passing minute. At 2:05 a.m., I decided to check Isabel's room. Perhaps she'd fallen asleep or had trouble getting away from Wesley. Moving as quietly as possible, I retraced my steps down the hallway to their door. I raised my hand to knock softly, then hesitated. From inside, I could hear muffled voices, Wesley and Isabel in what sounded like a heated argument, though their words were indistinct. Before I could decide whether to interrupt, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I nearly cried out in surprise, spinning around to find Thomas standing behind me, his expression grim. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "I couldn't sleep," I lied. "Thought I heard voices." Thomas studied me for a moment, clearly skeptical. "In the middle of the night? Fully dressed?" I had no good answer for that. We stared at each other in the dim hallway at an impasse. Finally, Thomas sighed. "Go back to your room. Whatever you're planning, it's a bad idea." "I don't know what you mean," I maintained weakly. "Yes, you do. His voice hardened. "And if I figured it out, so will Terrence. Do yourself a favor and stay put until morning." Was that a threat or a warning? I couldn't tell from his tone or expression. "Thomas," I began cautiously, "I don't think things are what they seem here." "Terrence, don't," he cut me off. "Just don't. Go back to your room. Lock your door. We'll deal with everything in the morning." Before I could respond, the door to Wesley and Isabel's room opened abruptly. Wesley stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous. "What's going on out here?" he demanded. Thomas and I both fell silent, caught like guilty teenagers. "Nothing." Thomas recovered first. "Just ran into each other in the hallway." Wesley's eyes narrowed as he took in my fully dressed state. "At 2 a.m.? Couldn't sleep," I repeated my earlier lie. "Was going to make some tea." "In the dark?" Wesley challenged. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. I glanced past Wesley into his room, hoping to catch sight of Isabel to signal her somehow. But the room behind him appeared empty. "Where's Isabel?" I asked, unable to keep the concern from my voice. Wesley's expression darkened further. "Why do you ask? She's not in there with you?" A tense silence followed my question. Wesley and Thomas exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. "She went to the bathroom a while ago," Wesley said finally. "She hasn't come back." The bathroom was just 2 doors down from their room, clearly visible from where we stood. Its door was open, the interior dark. A cold dread settled in my stomach. "Where is she, Wesley?" His face betrayed nothing. Perhaps she couldn't sleep either. Maybe she's in the kitchen making tea like you claim to be doing. "I just came from there. She's not in the kitchen." Another loaded glance between Wesley and Thomas. My unease deepened. "Let's check the living room," Thomas suggested, his tone deliberately casual. The 3 of us moved toward the main room, an awkward procession in the darkened hallway. As we entered the larger space, Wesley flipped a switch, flooding the room with harsh overhead light. The space was empty, the front door still closed and locked. "See?" Wesley gestured around. "Not here either. She's probably just stepped outside for some air." "In the middle of the night? In these temperatures?" I shook my head. "Something's wrong." "You seem very concerned," Wesley observed, his tone taking on an edge I'd never heard from him before. "Any particular reason?" Before I could respond, a door opened at the far end of the living room, Terrence's bedroom. He appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled from sleep, expression alert despite the hour. "What's going on?" he asked, taking in the 3 of us standing in the illuminated living room. "We're looking for Isabel," I said before either of the others could speak. "She seems to have disappeared." Terrence's gaze sharpened. "Disappeared?" "She's probably just outside," Wesley repeated, though he sounded less convinced now. "At 2 a.m.? In freezing temperatures?" I challenged. "I don't think so." "Why were you looking for her at this hour anyway?" Terrence asked, moving further into the room. I made a split-second decision. "Because she found something in your bag. Something that suggests this whole weekend is part of a plan you've been orchestrating." Terrence's expression didn't change, but a muscle twitched in his jaw, the same tell I'd noticed at dinner. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," I pressed. "An itinerary, with some very interesting notes about securing confessions and chemical assists." Wesley turned to Terrence, confusion evident on his face. "What is he talking about?" "Sounds like our friend has been going through my things," Terrence said smoothly. "Finding things he doesn't understand and jumping to conclusions. I didn't find it." "Isabel did," I clarified. "And now she's missing. Coincidence?" A tense silence fell over the room. I was acutely aware of my vulnerable position, outnumbered 3-1 with no way to be certain where anyone's loyalties truly lay. "Where's Nora?" I asked suddenly, realizing I hadn't seen or heard from her since our conversation outside. "Asleep in her room, I assume," Thomas replied, but something in his tone made me doubt him. "Let's check," I suggested, already moving toward the hallway. No one moved to stop me as I approached Nora's door. I knocked softly, then more insistently when there was no response. Finally, I tried the handle, unlocked. Pushing the door open, I found the room empty, the bed neatly made as if it hadn't been slept in at all. "She's not here," I announced, turning back to the others who had followed me down the hallway. Neither of them is here. This is ridiculous, Terrence said, but I detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. They have to be somewhere in or around the cabin. Then let's search, I challenged. Thoroughly. Right now. What followed was a tense room-by-room inspection of the cabin, with Terrence insisting on accompanying me every step of the way. We found nothing. No sign of Isabel or Nora, no indication of where they might have gone. They must have gone outside, Wesley concluded as we regrouped in the living room. Though why they do that at this hour? Let's check, I said, moving toward the front door. As I reached for the handle, Terrence stepped in front of me. Wait, if they are out there wandering around in the dark, we need to be organized about this. Flashlights, proper clothing. It's dangerous out there at night. Easy to get lost in the woods. His concern seemed genuine, but after everything I'd learned, I was inclined to doubt his every word and action. Still, he had a point about being prepared. Fine, I conceded. Flashlights, jackets, then we search. Terrence nodded, visibly relieved. There are flashlights in the kitchen drawer. I'll get them. As he moved away, I turned to Wesley. Did Isabel say anything to you about being concerned? About Terrence, about this weekend? He hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. She was uneasy, but she wouldn't tell me why. And that didn't strike you as odd? Of course it did, he snapped. But I didn't think she'd just wander off in the middle of the night without telling me. Unless she felt she couldn't tell you, I suggested. Unless she thought you wouldn't believe her. Wesley's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you implying? That Terrence has been manipulating all of us. That Bryce might never have died at all. That this whole weekend is about something else entirely. Thomas, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. He's right. Wesley and I both turned to him in surprise. What? Wesley demanded. Terrence has been lying to us, Thomas said quietly. About everything. Thomas's admission hung in the air, a confirmation of my worst suspicions. Before either Wesley or I could respond, Terrence returned from the kitchen, 4 flashlights in hand. Here we go, he announced, seemingly oblivious to the tension he'd walked into. 1 for each of us. The moment felt surreal, Terrence calmly distributing flashlights while 2 women were missing and his elaborate deception was beginning to unravel. I took the offered flashlight mechanically, my mind racing to process Thomas's confirmation and decide on the best course of action. Terrence, Wesley said, his voice strained. I think we need to talk before we go out there. Terrence paused, wariness creeping into his expression. About what? About the truth, I interjected before Wesley could continue. About why we're really here. About what really happened to Bryce. For a long moment, Terrence said nothing, his gaze shifting between the 3 of us. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the formulation of new lies. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, his tone deliberately calm. We're here because of exactly what I told you. Catherine's suicide note, the reopened investigation. There's no ulterior motive. Thomas seems to think otherwise, I challenged. Terrence's eyes snapped to Thomas, who met his gaze unflinchingly. What have you been saying? That you've been lying, Thomas replied simply. About all of it. Another tense silence descended, broken only by the subtle creaking of the cabin around us. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees and occasionally buffeting the windows. This is absurd, Terrence said eventually, but his confident demeanor had slipped slightly. We're wasting time. Isabel and Nora are out there somewhere. Are they? I interrupted. Or is this another part of your plan? The itinerary mentioned securing confessions for Sunday. That's today. Were Isabel and Nora not cooperating with your timeline? Terrence's expression hardened. I don't know what Isabel claims to have found, but you're misinterpreting it. And right now, my only concern is finding them before they get lost or hurt in those woods. Then tell us the truth, Wesley demanded, surprising me with his firmness. What really happened to Bryce? What is this weekend really about? Terrence seemed to deflate slightly, the facade cracking at last. He sank onto one of the couches, suddenly looking every one of his years. It's complicated, he began, voice uncharacteristically subdued. We've got time, I said coldly, though my mind screamed that we didn't. Not if Isabel and Nora were truly in danger. Terrence ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress. Bryce didn't die that night on the beach, he admitted finally. At least not the way I said. The confirmation sent a wave of relief through me, quickly followed by anger. So I didn't kill him? No, Terrence shook his head. You had an argument with him, yes. You followed him to the jetty, had words, but when you left him, he was very much alive. Then what happened to him? Wesley asked, his face a mask of confusion. We all remember the story about the accident, about helping to bury him. Because that's what I told you the next morning, Terrence said wearily. And you believed me. All of you. But why? I demanded. Why the elaborate lie? Terrence's eyes met mine, and for the first time since our arrival, I saw genuine emotion there. A mixture of guilt, fear, and something deeper I couldn't immediately identify. She went to the bathroom a while ago, Wesley said finally. She hasn't come back. The bathroom was just 2 doors down from their room, clearly visible from where we stood. Its door was open, the interior dark. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Where is she, Wesley? His face betrayed nothing. Perhaps she couldn't sleep either. Maybe she's in the kitchen making tea like you claim to be doing. I just came from there. She's not in the kitchen. Another loaded glance between Wesley and Thomas. My unease deepened. Let's check the living room, Thomas suggested, his tone deliberately casual. The 3 of us moved toward the main room, an awkward procession in the darkened hallway. As we entered the larger space, Wesley flipped a switch, flooding the room with harsh overhead light. The space was empty, the front door still closed and locked. See? Wesley gestured around. Not here either. She's probably just stepped outside for some air. In the middle of the night? In these temperatures? I shook my head. Something's wrong. You seem very concerned, Wesley observed, his tone taking on an edge I'd never heard from him before. Any particular reason? Before I could respond, a door opened at the far end of the living room, Terrence's bedroom. He appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled from sleep, expression alert despite the hour. What's going on? He asked, taking in the 3 of us standing in the illuminated living room. We're looking for Isabel, I said before either of the others could speak. She seems to have disappeared. Terrence's gaze sharpened. Disappeared? She's probably just outside, Wesley repeated, though he sounded less convinced now. At 2 a.m.? In freezing temperatures? I challenged. I don't think so. Why were you looking for her at this hour anyway? Terrence asked, moving further into the room. I made a split-second decision. Because she found something in your bag. Something that suggests this whole weekend is part of a plan you've been orchestrating. Terrence's expression didn't change, but a muscle twitched in his jaw, the same tell I'd noticed at dinner. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, I pressed. An itinerary, with some very interesting notes about securing confessions and chemical assists. Wesley turned to Terrence, confusion evident on his face. What is he talking about? Sounds like our friend has been going through my things, Terrence said smoothly. Finding things he doesn't understand and jumping to conclusions. I didn't find it. Isabel did, I clarified. And now she's missing. Coincidence? A tense silence fell over the room. I was acutely aware of my vulnerable position, outnumbered 3-1 with no way to be certain where anyone's loyalties truly lay. Where's Nora? I asked suddenly, realizing I hadn't seen or heard from her since our conversation outside. Asleep in her room, I assume, Thomas replied, but something in his tone made me doubt him. Let's check, I suggested, already moving toward the hallway. No one moved to stop me as I approached Nora's door. I knocked softly, then more insistently when there was no response. Finally, I tried the handle, unlocked. Pushing the door open, I found the room empty, the bed neatly made as if it hadn't been slept in at all. She's not here, I announced, turning back to the others who had followed me down the hallway. Neither of them is here. This is ridiculous, Terrence said, but I detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. They have to be somewhere in or around the cabin. Then let's search, I challenged. Thoroughly. Right now. What followed was a tense room-by-room inspection of the cabin, with Terrence insisting on accompanying me every step of the way. We found nothing. No sign of Isabel or Nora. No indication of where they might have gone. They must have gone outside, Wesley concluded as we regrouped in the living room. Though why they do that at this hour? Let's check, I said, moving toward the front door. As I reached for the handle, Terrence stepped in front of me. Wait, if they are out there wandering around in the dark, we need to be organized about this. Flashlights, proper clothing. It's dangerous out there at night. Easy to get lost in the woods. His concern seemed genuine, but after everything I'd learned, I was inclined to doubt his every word and action. Still, he had a point about being prepared. Fine, I conceded. Flashlights, jackets, then we search. Terrence nodded, visibly relieved. There are flashlights in the kitchen drawer. I'll get them. As he moved away, I turned to Wesley. Did Isabel say anything to you about being concerned? About Terrence, about this weekend? He hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. She was uneasy, but she wouldn't tell me why. And that didn't strike you as odd? Of course it did, he snapped. But I didn't think she'd just wander off in the middle of the night without telling me. Unless she felt she couldn't tell you, I suggested. Unless she thought you wouldn't believe her. Wesley's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you implying? That Terrence has been manipulating all of us. That Bryce might never have died at all. That this whole weekend is about something else entirely. Thomas, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. He's right. Wesley and I both turned to him in surprise. What? Wesley demanded. Terrence has been lying to us, Thomas said quietly. About everything. Thomas's admission hung in the air, a confirmation of my worst suspicions. Before either Wesley or I could respond, Terrence returned from the kitchen, 4 flashlights in hand. Here we go, he announced, seemingly oblivious to the tension he'd walked into. One for each of us. The moment felt surreal. Terrence calmly distributing flashlights while 2 women were missing and his elaborate deception was beginning to unravel. I took the offered flashlight mechanically, my mind racing to process Thomas's confirmation and decide on the best course of action. Terrence, Wesley said, his voice strained. I think we need to talk before we go out there. Terrence paused, wariness creeping into his expression. About what? About the truth, I interjected before Wesley could continue. About why we're really here. About what really happened to Bryce. For a long moment, Terrence said nothing, his gaze shifting between the 3 of us. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the formulation of new lies. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, his tone deliberately calm. We're here because of exactly what I told you. Catherine's suicide note, the reopened investigation. There's no ulterior motive. Thomas seems to think otherwise, I challenged. Terrence's eyes snapped to Thomas, who met his gaze unflinchingly. What have you been saying? That you've been lying, Thomas replied simply. About all of it. Another tense silence descended, broken only by the subtle creaking of the cabin around us. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees and occasionally buffeting the windows. This is absurd, Terrence said eventually, but his confident demeanor had slipped slightly. We're wasting time. Isabel and Nora are out there somewhere. Are they? I interrupted. Or is this another part of your plan? The itinerary mentioned securing confessions for Sunday. That's today. Were Isabel and Nora not cooperating with your timeline? Terrence's expression hardened. I don't know what Isabel claims to have found, but you're misinterpreting it. And right now, my only concern is finding them before they get lost or hurt in those woods. Then tell us the truth, Wesley demanded, surprising me with his firmness. What really happened to Bryce? What is this weekend really about? Terrence seemed to deflate slightly, the facade cracking at last. He sank onto one of the couches, suddenly looking every one of his years. It's complicated, he began, voice uncharacteristically subdued. We've got time, I said coldly, though my mind screamed that we didn't, not if Isabel and Nora were truly in danger. Terrence ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress. Bryce didn't die that night on the beach, he admitted finally. At least not the way I said. The confirmation sent a wave of relief through me, quickly followed by anger. So I didn't kill him? No, Terrence shook his head. You had an argument with him, yes. You followed him to the jetty, had words. But when you left him, he was very much alive. Then what happened to him? Wesley asked, his face a mask of confusion. We all remember the story about the accident, about helping to bury him. Because that's what I told you the next morning, Terrence said wearily. And you believed me. All of you. But why? I demanded. Why the elaborate lie? Terrence's eyes met mine, and for the first time since our arrival, I saw genuine emotion there, a mixture of guilt, fear, and something deeper I couldn't immediately identify. Because Bryce threatened to expose something about me, something that would have destroyed my life, my future. He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself before continuing. He'd discovered I was cheating my way through Professor Harmon's advanced economics seminar, using papers purchased online, paying a graduate student to take my exams. It was my major, the foundation for the career I'd planned. The revelation seemed simultaneously momentous and trivial, life-altering for a college student, perhaps, but hardly worth decades of deception. That's it? Wesley asked incredulously. Academic fraud? That's what all this has been about? You don't understand, Terrence insisted. My father had pulled strings to secure me a position at his firm upon graduation. Everything depended on my maintaining my academic standing. If I'd been expelled for cheating, I would have lost everything. So what did you do? I pressed, sensing there was more to the story. Terrence's gaze dropped to his hands. I followed Bryce after you left him on the beach. Tried to reason with him, offer him money to keep quiet. He refused. We argued. Things escalated. You killed him, Thomas said flatly. Terrence flinched but didn't deny it. It wasn't planned. We struggled. He fell against the rocks, hit his head. By the time I realized how serious it was too late. And then you came up with a plan to frame me, I concluded, anger coursing through me. Not initially, Terrence countered. At first I just panicked, dragged his body further down the beach where it wouldn't be found immediately. But then I remembered your argument with him earlier, how public it had been, how everyone had seen you follow him. So you decided to use me as your scapegoat, I said bitterly. I came back to the house, told the others you'd returned earlier, distraught, talking about an accident, that you'd gone to your room and passed out, while you were actually still out looking for Bryce. The rest of us went to the spot I claimed you'd described. And we found a body, Wesley said slowly, the memories seemingly resurfacing as Terrence spoke. You found Bryce's body, which I'd placed there, Terrence confirmed. I convinced you all that we needed to protect our friend. He nodded toward me, said that no one would believe it was an accident given the argument everyone had witnessed. But I never came back claiming I'd killed him, I said, the pieces finally fitting together. I was still out searching for him. Yes, and when you did return the next morning, we'd already moved the body. I told the others you were in shock, blocking out what had happened. That your memory lapse was a psychological response to trauma. And they believed you, I said, glancing at Wesley and Thomas. All of you. We did, Wesley admitted, his face ashen. God help us, we did. But why maintain the lie for 20 years? I asked, turning back to Terrence. Why bring us all back here now? Terrence's expression darkened. Because someone started asking questions. Someone who knew too much in Catherine, I realized. You mentioned her suicide note, but Isabel checked. There was no note that mentioned Bryce. Not in her suicide note, no, Terrence conceded. But in the weeks before her death, she contacted me, said she'd been talking to Nora, that they'd compared memories about that night and realized things didn't add up. She threatened to go to the police. A cold dread washed over me. So you, what? Silenced her? Terrence didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. And then you arranged this weekend to do the same to the rest of us, Thomas concluded grimly. To eliminate everyone who knew anything about what really happened. Not everyone, Terrence protested weakly. Just those who were starting to question the narrative, Nora, Isabel. And me, I added, since I never actually had the memories you planted in everyone else. Terrence didn't deny it. Where are they, Terrence? Wesley demanded, his voice hard. Where are Isabel and Nora? For a moment I thought Terrence might continue to deny everything, to maintain his crumbling facade. But something in him seemed to collapse. The shed, he said quietly, behind the cabin. I drugged their drinks at dinner. When everyone was asleep, I moved them. Wesley was on his feet instantly, heading for the door. Thomas and I followed, leaving Terrence sitting on the couch, suddenly looking old and defeated. Should we restrain him? Thomas asked as we grabbed our jackets. I'm not going anywhere, Terrence called after us. It's over. I know that. Despite his assurance, I grabbed the car keys from the bowl by the door, pocketing them before following Wesley and Thomas outside. The night air hit like a physical force, cold and damp. Our breath clouded in the beam of the flashlights as we hurried around the side of the cabin, following a narrow path that led to a small shed partially hidden by pine trees. Wesley reached it first, fumbling with a padlock on the door. It's locked. Here, Thomas pushed forward, producing a small multi-tool from his pocket. After a tense minute of manipulation, the lock sprang open. Wesley yanked the door wide, shining his flashlight into the dark interior. Two figures lay on the dirt floor, bound and gagged but stirring at the sudden light and commotion. Isabel! Wesley rushed to his wife, dropping to his knees beside her. Thomas moved to Nora, carefully removing the gag from her mouth and working on the ropes binding her wrists. I stood in the doorway, relief washing over me at finding them alive. As Wesley helped Isabel to a sitting position and removed her gag, she gasped for air, then immediately tried to speak. Terrence, she managed, her voice raspy. He knows we know, I assured her. He's confessed everything. About Bryce, about his plan for this weekend. Not everything, Nora croaked as Thomas helped her to her feet. Not about the others. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept up my spine. What others? There have been others over the years, Nora explained, leaning heavily on Thomas. People who got too close to his secrets. He's been protecting his carefully constructed life for decades, eliminating anyone who threatened it. How do you know this? Wesley asked, helping Isabel to stand. Catherine told me before she died, Nora said. She'd been investigating him for years, connecting cases, disappearances. That's why he killed her, not just because she knew about Bryce, but because she knew about all of them. The enormity of what she was suggesting stunned me into momentary silence. Terrence wasn't just a man who'd made a terrible mistake in college and covered it up. He was a calculating killer who had continued his pattern for decades. We need to get to the authorities, Thomas said urgently. All of us together with everything we know. Terrence is still in the cabin, I reminded them. We should... The sharp crack of a gunshot cut through the night, making us all flinch. It had come from the direction of the cabin. Stay here, I ordered, already moving back toward the path. Lock the door. You can't go alone, Wesley protested. We can't all go and leave Isabel and Nora vulnerable, I countered. Stay with them. I'll check what happened. Before anyone could argue further, I was running back toward the cabin, heart pounding, flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the ground. Had Terrence shot someone else? Was there another person we hadn't accounted for? As I rounded the corner of the cabin, I saw that the front door stood open, spilling light onto the porch. Approaching cautiously, I called out, Terrence? No response. With extreme caution, I climbed the steps and peered inside. The living room was empty, but something on the couch caught my eye. A dark stain spreading across the cushion where Terrence had been sitting. Following an instinct, I moved through the cabin toward Terrence's bedroom. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, the beam of my flashlight illuminated a scene I'll never forget. Terrence lay on the floor beside his bed, a revolver still clutched in his right hand, a devastating wound to his head. On the bed was a handwritten note, the paper spotted with blood droplets. I moved closer, careful not to disturb anything, and read the words he'd scrawled in a shaky hand. I never meant for it to go this far. One lie led to another and another until there was no way back. Bryce was just the beginning. Tell them I'm sorry. It won't mean anything, but tell them anyway. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, a final, faltering attempt at taking responsibility for actions too late to rectify. I backed out of the room, a complex mix of emotions churning within me. Relief that the immediate threat was over, horror at what Terrence had become, and a profound sadness for the promising young man I'd once called friend, whose life had derailed so completely from a single terrible choice. Outside, I found the others had ignored my instructions and followed me to the cabin. I met them on the porch, my expression telling them what they needed to know before I spoke. "He's gone," I confirmed quietly. Self-inflicted. He left a note confessing to everything. Wesley sank onto the porch steps, head in his hands. Isabel joined him, placing a comforting arm around his shoulders despite her own ordeal. Thomas supported Nora, who looked ready to collapse from exhaustion and stress. "What now?" Thomas asked, voicing the question on all our minds. "Now we do what we should have done 20 years ago," I said firmly. "We contact the authorities. Tell them everything. About Bryce, about Catherine, about whatever other victims there might have been. No more secrets, no more lies." As dawn began to break over the forest, casting the first pale light across the clearing, we sat together on the porch of the cabin. 5 survivors bound by a shared history we were only now beginning to fully understand. The weight of 2 decades of secrets lifted gradually as we talked, filling in the gaps in each other's memories, reconstructing the truth from the fragments Terrence had allowed each of us to retain. By unspoken agreement, we waited until full daylight to use Thomas's truck to drive to the nearest town and contact the police. The following days were a blur of statements, investigations, and revelations as authorities pieced together the full extent of Terrence's crimes over the years. Bryce's remains were found exactly where Terrence had led us that first day, providing his family with long overdue answers and closure. Catherine's death was reopened as a homicide investigation rather than a suicide, and as Nora had suggested, other cases emerged. Disappearances and deaths spanning 2 decades, all connected to Terrence in ways that had previously gone unnoticed. For my part, I found a strange peace in finally understanding the truth about that night so long ago. The guilt I'd carried subconsciously all these years, a guilt implanted by Terrence's manipulation, began to dissolve, replaced by a clearer perspective on both the past and the future. The 6 college friends who had gathered for that fateful spring break were now permanently reduced to 5, bound not by the false narrative that had constrained us for so long, but by the shared experience of finally confronting the truth, no matter how painful. As I drove away from the police station after my final statement, having said goodbye to the others with promises to stay in genuine contact this time, I found myself thinking about memory, its fragility, its malleability, and ultimately its power. Terrence had understood that power and weaponized it against us all, but in the end, the truth had found its way to the surface, as truth inevitably does. The road ahead stretched out before me, no longer shadowed by half-remembered guilt or vague unease. For the first time in 20 years, I drove toward a future unburdened by a past that had never truly been mine to carry. The snow started falling harder just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. My friend Thomas and I had been planning this camping trip for months, one final outdoor adventure before winter fully claimed the wilderness. We had chosen Whispering Pines National Forest, specifically for its remote beauty, a place where cell signals vanished and the modern world felt centuries away instead of mere miles. Weather reports said light flurries. "Nothing serious," Thomas had reassured me that morning as we hiked deeper into the forest, our breath-forming clouds in the crisp autumn air. I remembered the confidence in his voice, so certain we'd be fine. By late afternoon, we'd found a suitable clearing about 5 miles from the nearest trail marker. The first few snowflakes began falling as we set up our tent, tiny crystalline messengers of what was to come. Within an hour, the gentle snowfall had transformed into something more ominous. "I'm going to grab more firewood before it gets covered," Thomas announced, zipping up his jacket. "Keep working on that fire. We'll need it tonight." I nodded, focusing on the small flame I was nursing among the kindling. "Don't go too far. Storm's picking up." 20 minutes, tops," he replied, his voice already fading as he moved between the darkening trees. I continued tending the fire, occasionally glancing at my watch. 20 minutes passed, then 30. At 45 minutes, the snow was falling in thick sheets and the daylight had almost completely surrendered to dusk. "Thomas," I called, my voice seeming to travel only a few feet before being swallowed by the densely falling snow. No response. An hour after he'd left, I could no longer ignore the cold dread settling in my stomach. The fire was steadily burning now, but Thomas remained absent. I grabbed my flashlight, extra batteries, and a compass, then zipped my jacket to my chin. Thomas, I shouted once more before leaving our campsite, my voice dispersing into the vast whiteness around me. The temperature had dropped dramatically. What had been brisk but tolerable hours earlier now bit at my exposed face. The snow was already several inches deep, obscuring the forest floor and transforming familiar terrain into an alien landscape. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness but revealed little beyond swirling snowflakes. I tried to move in concentric circles from our camp, calling Thomas's name every few steps. Each time, silence answered. The wind chill factor intensified as night fully descended, and I realized with growing alarm that my search was becoming increasingly dangerous for us both. 2 hours into my search, all semblance of direction had abandoned me. The compass needle spun erratically, rendered useless by an unseen magnetic anomaly in the area, something the park rangers had neglected to mention in their trail guides. My flashlight beam weakened, despite the fresh batteries, its glow barely penetrating the wall of white before me. Thomas. My voice had grown hoarse from shouting. The storm had intensified into a proper blizzard, visibility reduced to mere feet. The forest had transformed from a place of beauty into an architect of fear. Tree branches, heavy with snow, reached like gnarled fingers through the darkness. The wind changed direction constantly, disorienting me further and driving ice crystals against my face with stinging precision. I stumbled over something solid beneath the snow, a fallen log, and crashed face first into the powdery ground. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and for a moment I lay there gasping, the cold immediately seeping through my clothes. Getting back to my feet took tremendous effort, my muscles already stiffening from exposure. My ears began to play tricks on me. Sometimes I thought I heard Thomas calling, only to run toward the sound and find nothing but more trees, more snow, more emptiness. Other times I could swear someone was walking just behind me, footsteps crunching in perfect sync with my own, stopping when I stopped. The rational part of my brain knew this was the beginning of hypothermia, the confusion, the auditory hallucinations. Yet knowing the source of these delusions didn't make them less terrifying. I stumbled onward, my pace slowing as exhaustion and cold worked together against me. The forest seemed to shift around me, landmarks appearing and disappearing in the swirling snow. The beam of my flashlight caught something reflective ahead, a pair of eyes watching from between two trees. I froze, heart pounding. "Thomas?" I whispered, my voice failing me. The eyes blinked once, then vanished. I rushed forward, desperate for human contact, but found only an empty space between frost-covered pines. The confusion was getting worse. I knew I needed shelter, needed to get warm, but the campsite could have been miles away in any direction. The night seemed eternal, the cold absolute. I began to wonder if I would ever feel warmth again. The third hour brought with it a dangerous serenity. My shivering had almost stopped, not a good sign as I dimly recalled from wilderness survival guides. My movements became sluggish, thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. I no longer called for Thomas. Conservation of energy seemed more important now, though some distant part of me recognized this as surrender. The snow had accumulated to mid-calf depth, each step requiring tremendous effort. My boots, once waterproof, had succumbed to the persistent moisture, leaving my feet numb blocks of ice. The forest played a symphony of creaks and moans as wind rushed through the trees. Sometimes the sounds organized themselves into words, unintelligible whispers that seemed just beyond comprehension. I knew they weren't real, yet found myself straining to understand them anyway. My flashlight finally died, plunging me into near-total darkness. The overcast sky blocked any moonlight or stars that might have guided me. Only the faint luminescence of snow provided any visibility at all, transforming the forest into a negative photograph of itself. Black trees against slightly less black surroundings. When I fell for perhaps the 10th time, I lacked the strength to rise immediately. The snow felt almost comfortable, a soft bed inviting me to rest. Just for a moment, I thought, just to gather strength. The dangerous comfort of hypothermia wrapped around me like a deceptive blanket. My eyelids grew heavy, my breathing slowed. Thoughts of warmth, summer days, hot showers, burning campfires floated through my mind with tantalizing clarity. With tremendous effort, I forced myself to move, crawling now rather than walking. My hands had lost all sensation, working on muscle memory alone. I knew that sleep meant death, yet death seemed increasingly peaceful compared to this endless struggle. Images from my life flashed before me: childhood birthdays, college graduation, the day I met Thomas. These memories felt more real than the freezing forest surrounding me. I wondered if this was what drowning felt like, this strange mixture of panic and peace. The wind changed suddenly, bringing with it a scent that didn't belong: wood smoke. My numbed brain took long seconds to process this information. Wood smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant salvation. I raised my head, peering through the darkness. Far off, perhaps half a mile, a faint orange glow pulsed against the night. It could have been another hallucination. My dying brain manufacturing hope where none existed, but it remained steady, unwavering, unlike my previous delusions. Using the last reserves of my strength, I oriented myself toward that distant light and began to crawl. The glow grew stronger as I approached, resolving itself into the warm light of windows from a small structure nestled among the trees. A ranger station, I realized, one of the remote outposts positioned throughout the national forest for emergencies exactly like this one. The last 100 yards nearly defeated me. My body had nothing left to give, running on fumes and desperation. The light from the cabin windows spilled onto the snow, creating a golden path that I followed on hands and knees. I reached the wooden stairs leading to the porch and pulled myself up one by one, each movement an exercise in agony as blood struggled to circulate through my extremities. At the door, I lacked the strength to knock properly, instead slumping against it, my weight causing a dull thud. Consciousness wavered, darkness encroaching at the edges of my vision. I heard movement inside, then the creak of hinges as the door opened inward. I fell across the threshold, no longer able to support myself. Strong hands grabbed me, pulling me inside. The heat hit like a physical force, painful in its intensity after hours in the freezing cold. My skin burned as though I'd been thrust into fire rather than a modestly heated cabin. "Jesus," a gruff voice said from somewhere above me. "You're half dead, friend." I couldn't respond, my throat raw from shouting, my mind still trying to process the rapid transition from dying to possible survival. The ranger, a man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, wrapped me in thick wool blankets and propped me near the wood stove dominating one wall of the small cabin. "Need to get these wet clothes off you," he muttered, efficiently stripping away my frozen outer layers. "Warm you up gradually. Too fast is dangerous." The pain intensified as circulation returned to my extremities. Pins and needles became knives and spears, radiating from my fingers and toes inward. I might have screamed. I don't recall. The ranger worked methodically, rubbing my limbs with rough towels to stimulate blood flow. "Can you swallow?" he asked, holding a steaming mug near my face. The scent of broth reached me: chicken, salt, herbs. He supported my head as I took small sips, the warm liquid tracing a path of fire down my throat to my stomach. "Thomas," I managed to croak after several minutes of this treatment. "My friend, still out there?" The ranger's expression darkened. Blizzard's hitting hard. "Nobody's going anywhere tonight." "Please," I begged, trying to rise and immediately falling back. "He'll die." "You nearly died yourself," he countered firmly. "I'll radio this in. Get a search party organized for first light. That's the best we can do right now." The rational part of me knew he was right, but the thought of Thomas alone in that killing cold tore at me. I had escaped. He remained trapped. "What's your name?" the ranger asked, clearly trying to keep me focused. "Michael," I answered, the word feeling strange on my tongue, as though I was remembering someone else's identity rather than my own. "I'm Ranger Howard," he replied. "You're at Echo Lake Station. You're lucky. This outpost isn't manned year-round. I'm only here doing maintenance before the heavy snows hit." Lucky. The word seemed absurd given the circumstances, yet I couldn't deny its accuracy. Without this cabin, without Howard's presence, I would have become another statistic, another hiker who underestimated nature's capacity for cruelty. As warmth gradually reclaimed my body, exhaustion took its place. Despite my concern for Thomas, despite the lingering pain, my eyelids grew heavy. Howard noticed. "Sleep," he advised, adjusting the blankets around me. "Nothing more to be done tonight." I fought it briefly, then surrendered to the darkness. Dawn arrived with deceptive beauty, The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine world of white. Sunlight sparkled off untouched snow, transforming the forest into a crystalline wonderland. From the cabin's window, it seemed impossible that such beauty could be so deadly. I had slept fitfully, dreams filled with pursuing shadows and endless white tunnels. Howard had maintained the fire throughout the night, and I awoke to find him already dressed in cold weather gear and preparing equipment. "How are you feeling?" he asked, noting my awakened state. Physical inventory revealed mixed results. My extremities still burned and tingled, especially my toes and fingertips. Movement was painful but possible. The bone-deep cold had receded, replaced by generalized soreness and fatigue. "I'll live," I replied, struggling to a sitting position. "Have you heard anything about search parties?" Howard nodded. "Radio contact at dawn. 3 rangers are converging on this area from different stations. They'll be here within the hour, then we'll coordinate the search." I pushed myself to my feet, swaying slightly. "I'm coming too." "You're in no condition." "He's my friend," I interrupted. "I know what direction he went initially. I can help." Howard studied me, then gave a reluctant nod. "We'll see what the doctor says when she arrives with the others." The doctor, a compact woman named Dr. Keller, arrived with 2 additional rangers 40 minutes later. After a brief but thorough examination, she reluctantly cleared me to join the search party, provided I remained partnered with Howard at all times. "Your frostbite is mild, surprisingly," she explained, examining my reddened fingertips. "But you're still at risk for hypothermia if you overexert yourself. Stay close to Ranger Howard and don't push your limits." The search party organized efficiently, establishing a grid pattern centered around my description of our campsite. Armed with radios, emergency medical supplies, and GPS devices, we set out into the transformed landscape. Finding the campsite proved easier than expected. Though partially buried by snow, our tent remained visible, its bright blue fabric a stark contrast against the whiteness. The fire pit had been completely covered, but Thomas's backpack remained where he'd left it, propped against a tree. "He went that way for firewood," I said, pointing northeast from camp. "Said he wouldn't go far." "People disoriented by snow can travel surprising distances," one of the rangers commented, "especially if they panic." We spread out within shouting distance of each other, moving methodically through the forest. Every few minutes, someone would call Thomas's name, the sound carrying clearly through the still cold air. Each call was met with silence. Hours passed. My renewed strength began to wane as the afternoon progressed. Howard noticed my flagging pace and insisted on a brief rest, handing me a thermos of hot tea from his pack. "We'll find him," he assured me, though I heard the unspoken qualifier, one way or another. After nearly 6 hours of searching, when hope had begun to dim, a crackling radio transmission broke the somber mood. "Movement spotted near Blackwater Creek area. Appears to be a makeshift shelter under a fallen pine. Investigating now." Howard and I exchanged glances before hurrying in the direction indicated, following GPS coordinates relayed by the ranger who'd made the discovery. We found them at the base of a ravine. The ranger was kneeling beside a crude shelter fashioned from evergreen branches and what I recognized as Thomas's outer jacket. Inside this makeshift cocoon, barely visible, lay a human form. "Thomas!" I shouted, sliding down the ravine's edge without regard for personal safety. The ranger at the shelter looked up, his expression revealing nothing. "He's alive, barely." Those 2 words, "he's alive," hit me with physical force. Not too late, not a recovery operation, a rescue. Thomas lay curled in a fetal position within his improvised shelter. His face had taken on a ghastly bluish tinge, his lips cracked and bloodless. A small pit before the shelter contained the charred remains of what must have been a desperate attempt at fire. Twigs and bark that had burned briefly before dying out. Dr. Keller pushed past me, medical bag already open. "Give me space," she ordered, kneeling beside Thomas. The next minutes passed in a blur of activity. Thermal blankets appeared, wrapped carefully around Thomas's still form. Hot compresses applied to core areas, neck, armpits, groin, to gradually raise his temperature. An oxygen mask covered his face. The attached canister rushed down from one of the ranger's packs. "He's severely hypothermic," Dr. Keller announced, but he had the presence of mind to build shelter and attempt fire. That probably saved his life. Thomas's eyes fluttered open as they worked on him. Confusion gave way to recognition when his gaze found mine. "Mike," he whispered, the word barely audible through the oxygen mask. "Got lost. Couldn't find camp." "Don't talk," I urged him, grasping his blanketed shoulder. "Save your strength." The Rangers had already called for emergency evacuation. In these remote areas, the National Park Service maintained helicopter access points for critical situations. Thomas qualified. "Chopper's 20 minutes out," Howard informed us. "We need to move him to the extraction point." They transferred Thomas to a portable stretcher, securing him with straps and additional blankets. The journey to the extraction point, a clearing large enough for helicopter landing, became a grueling test of endurance. 6 of us took turns carrying the stretcher over uneven, snow-covered terrain, rotating positions frequently to prevent exhaustion. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness during the trek. Sometimes he would mutter incoherently, other times stare silently at the tree canopy passing overhead. Dr. Keller monitored him constantly, periodically adjusting his oxygen flow and checking vital signs. We reached the clearing just as the distant thrum of helicopter blades became audible. The aircraft appeared over the treetops minutes later, a red and white medical evacuation chopper that seemed impossibly civilized in this wilderness setting. As the helicopter descended, snow swirled upward in blinding clouds. The medical crew emerged before the blades had fully stopped, rushing toward us with professional urgency. The transfer from our stretcher to their equipment happened with practiced efficiency. "You coming with him?" one of the medics shouted to me over the engine noise. I looked to Howard, who nodded. "Go. We'll take care of the campsite. Get your friend to safety." I climbed aboard beside Thomas, grasping his hand as the helicopter lifted off. Below, the search party dwindled to tiny figures, then disappeared entirely as we rose above the forest canopy. The Regional Medical Center in Burlington was a fortress of modern medicine, all gleaming surfaces and fluorescent efficiency. Thomas disappeared immediately into the emergency department, surrounded by a team of doctors specialized in treating severe hypothermia and cold-related injuries. I found myself relegated to a waiting room, still wrapped in one of Howard's spare jackets, my own belongings left behind at the campsite. A kind nurse brought me coffee and a sandwich, which I consumed without tasting, my mind fixed entirely on Thomas's condition. 3 hours passed before a doctor emerged to speak with me. "He's stabilized," she began, and I felt tension drain from my shoulders. "But I won't minimize the severity of his condition. Your friend experienced prolonged exposure to extreme cold. We're dealing with moderate to severe frostbite on his extremities, particularly his feet and hands. Will he lose?" I couldn't finish the question. The doctor's expression softened slightly. "It's too early to make that determination. We're using the latest protocols to restore circulation gradually. The next 24-48 hours will be critical." She allowed me to see him briefly. Thomas lay in the ICU, surrounded by monitoring equipment, warming blankets, and IV lines. His skin had regained some color, but his hands and feet were wrapped in specialized bandages. He opened his eyes briefly when I approached, managed a weak smile, then drifted back to sleep under the influence of pain medication. I established a vigil in the waiting room, refusing all suggestions that I check into a hotel or seek treatment for my own, less severe injuries. Local police took my statement regarding the circumstances of our misadventure. A park ranger, not Howard but another official, arrived with our salvaged camping gear and my personal effects, retrieved from the abandoned site. Days blended together. Thomas's parents arrived from Boston, their faces drawn with worry. I recounted the story again, watching their expressions shift from horror to relief to renewed concern as they processed how close their son had come to death. Gradually, Thomas improved. The frostbite on his hands proved less severe than initially feared, though several fingertips would bear permanent damage. His feet had suffered more extensively. 2 toes on his left foot required partial amputation, a devastating blow to someone who had once been an avid hiker. I was present when he fully regained lucidity, when the doctors explained the extent of his injuries and likely recovery timeline. I watched him absorb this information with a stoicism that seemed beyond his years. You saved my life, he told me during a moment alone. If you hadn't searched, I got lost too, I admitted. Found the ranger station by pure luck. Thomas was silent for a moment. I remember building the shelter. I remembered the survival training about conserving heat. But I also remember other things. I waited, sensing his need to verbalize the experience. I thought someone was following me in the storm. Heard footsteps, whispers, saw shadows moving between trees. He paused. Hypothermia plays tricks on your mind, right? That's what the doctors say. I nodded, recalling my own auditory hallucinations. I heard things too. The cold. It changes your perception. Sometimes, Thomas continued, his voice dropping lower. I'm not convinced they were hallucinations. The forest felt aware, like it was watching us struggle. I couldn't dismiss his words, having experienced similar sensations myself. The forest had seemed to possess a malevolent consciousness during those frozen hours, an ancient awareness observing our human frailty with cold indifference. We survived, I said finally. That's what matters. 2 years have passed since that night in Whispering Pines Forest. Thomas recovered physically, adapting to his injuries with determination and resilience. The psychological healing proved more challenging for us both. Neither of us has gone camping since. The wilderness, once a source of joy and escape, now carries darker associations. Thomas focuses his outdoor activities on photographing nature from established trails and viewpoints, never venturing far from civilization. I've relocated to a city apartment, surrounded by concrete and constant noise that somehow feels safer than natural silence. Winter brings particular difficulties. The first snowfall each year triggers involuntary panic responses, elevated heart rate, cold sweats, disorientation. Therapists call it situational PTSD, a normal response to having faced death in such circumstances. They assure us the reactions will diminish with time and proper treatment. Sometimes at night, especially during winter storms, I find myself standing at my apartment window, watching snow accumulate on city streets. Even surrounded by streetlights and buildings, the falling white flakes transport me instantly back to that forest, to the absolute silence, the creeping cold, the desperate search for warmth and safety. Thomas and I meet monthly for coffee. We rarely discuss the incident directly, but its presence remains between us, an invisible bond forged in mutual survival. During our last meeting, he mentioned something that has lingered in my thoughts since. I researched Whispering Pines after I recovered, he said, stirring his coffee absently.
Did you know there have been an unusual number of disappearances there over the years?
Hikers, campers, people who just vanished. I hadn't known, though the information didn't surprise me. That forest contained something older and more primal than the ranger stations, and trail markers suggested something that predated human intrusion and would outlast it. Ranger Howard sent a letter 6 months after the incident. He'd retired from service, moving to Arizona, where he wrote, "The cold can't find me." His closing words captured perfectly what I had been unable to articulate. Nature isn't cruel or kind. It simply is. We forget this at our peril. The forest doesn't hate or love us. It exists according to laws more ancient than our understanding. Sometimes we need reminding of our proper place in that order. I keep his letter in my desk drawer, rereading it occasionally. The experience in Whispering Pines fundamentally altered my perception of humanity's relationship with the natural world. What I once saw as a playground or resource, I now recognize as an indifferent power deserving of profound respect and healthy fear. When snowflakes begin to fall, when temperatures drop and darkness comes early, I feel again the weight of that knowledge. In comfortable apartments and heated cars, we construct the illusion of dominion over nature's extremes. But the truth waits in places like Whispering Pines Forest, in the silent spaces between snowflakes, in the creaking of frost-laden branches. The truth is simple. We are all temporary visitors, existing on borrowed time within systems that barely acknowledge our presence. The cold doesn't care if we live or die. The snow continues falling either way. And somewhere in that forest, something still watches and waits for those who wander too far from safety, for those who forget their fragility in the face of winter's patient hunger. The crisp Montana air filled my lungs as I packed the last of my gear into my weathered Ford F-150. October in Big Sky Country meant unpredictable weather, but the forecast promised clear skies for at least the first few days of my trip. Perfect conditions for what I needed: solitude, silence, and a chance to clear my head. My name is Dustin Mitchell Yersam, a 35-year-old contractor with my own small business in Bozeman. Life had been a whirlwind lately, juggling building projects, caring for my 8-year-old daughter Madeline, and helping raise my 14-year-old stepson Trevor when they stayed with me. The divorce 2 years ago had been amicable enough, but the constant back and forth was wearing me down. This solo camping trip to Moose Creek was long overdue. "You sure about going alone, Dust?" My brother Wyatt leaned against my truck, concern evident in his expression. Weather can turn quick this time of year. I secured the last strap on my gear. Been planning this for months. Why, besides, I won't be completely alone. Brett's joining me for the last couple days. Brett Holloway had been my friend since high school, one of the few who stuck around after the divorce. "Just keep your satellite phone charged," Wyatt said, tossing me a small solar charger. "New toy. Consider it an early birthday present." "Thanks, brother." We embraced briefly, the way men do when they're uncomfortable with displays of emotion, but feel them deeply anyway. As I drove north toward the Gallatin National Forest, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway. The mountains loomed dark against the sky, beautiful, imposing, unconcerned with human troubles. I'd camped and hunted these areas for years, but something about this trip felt different. Looking back, I wonder if some part of me sensed what was coming. The turnoff to Moose Creek appeared after nearly 2 hours of driving. The dirt road narrowed as I climbed higher, patches of early snow dotting the shadowed areas beneath tall pines. My chosen campsite was remote, about 3 miles from the nearest frequently used trail. Privacy was what I craved. The sun was setting as I parked in a small clearing and began unloading. I worked efficiently, setting up my four-season tent, arranging the campsite, and gathering firewood before darkness fell completely. The first fire of the trip crackled to life as stars emerged overhead, impossibly bright away from city lights. I heated a simple dinner of chili and cornbread, savoring the quiet broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle in the underbrush. This was why I came. No phone calls, no client meetings, no complicated custody arrangements, just me and the mountains. That first night, I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the absolute darkness and the gentle rhythm of wind through pine boughs. Couldn't have known it would be one of my last peaceful nights alive. Dawn broke with the muted colors of early October, pale pinks and oranges staining the eastern sky. I woke refreshed, eager to explore the surrounding wilderness. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, I packed a day bag with essentials: water, jerky, a topographical map, first aid kit, and my trusted hunting knife. The trail I chose wound through dense forest before opening onto a ridge with spectacular views of the valley below. Golden aspen leaves trembled in the breeze, creating a flickering mosaic against the darker evergreens. I had the path entirely to myself, or so I thought. About 4 miles in, I noticed boot prints in a muddy section of trail. Nothing unusual about other hikers, but something about the pattern caught my attention. They appeared and disappeared at odd intervals, sometimes cutting straight through underbrush instead of following the path. Curious, but not alarming. I stopped for lunch at a small alpine lake, its surface perfectly mirroring the surrounding peaks. As I sat on a sun-warmed rock, movement on the opposite shore caught my eye. A figure stood partially obscured by trees, watching. I raised my hand in the universal hiker's greeting, but they didn't respond. When I blinked, they were gone. Probably just another solo hiker, I muttered to myself. But unease crept through me like cold water. On my return to camp, I twice had the distinct sensation of being followed. I'd stop, listen to the profound silence, then hear a twig snap or stones shift just after I resumed walking. Each time I turned, I saw nothing but empty trail behind me. The campsite appeared undisturbed when I returned in late afternoon. I busied myself gathering more firewood, trying to shake the feeling of being observed. The forest felt different now, less welcoming, more secretive. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. That evening, as I cooked a simple dinner over my camp stove, I heard a rustling approach from the direction of the access road. I reached for my hunting knife, tension coiling in my muscles. "Hello?" I called, relieved when the response came in a human voice. "Hey there. Got room for another camper?" A man emerged from the trees, mid-40s, lean, with a scraggly beard and worn hiking gear. He carried a small pack and had a friendly, if somewhat intense, smile. "I'm Darren," he said, extending his hand. "Saw your smoke and thought I'd say hello. Been hiking solo for a few days now." Something in his manner made me hesitate, but wilderness etiquette is strong in Montana. "You don't turn away fellow outdoorsmen without good reason." "Dustin," I replied, shaking his hand. "I've got plenty of space. Fire's just getting going." "Appreciate it," Darren said, dropping his pack near, but not too near my camp. "Got any beers in that cooler?" Happy to trade some jerky I made myself. I offered him a beer, which he accepted eagerly. As night fell, we exchanged the usual campers' talk, good trails in the area, weather forecasts, brief mentions of life back in civilization. Darren claimed to be from Missoula, working odd construction jobs, something we had in common. "Love it out here," he said, staring into the fire, away from people. "People can be disappointing, you know." "Sometimes," I agreed cautiously. "That's why we escape occasionally." His eyes reflected the flames when he looked up. "But we can't really escape, can we? Not from ourselves." The conversation grew increasingly uncomfortable as night deepened. Darren's questions became more personal. Did I come here often? Was anyone expecting me? Did I have family nearby? I answered vaguely, instinct warning me to keep details to myself. When he finally retreated to set up his small tent about 50 yards from mine, I exhaled tension I hadn't realized I was holding. I secured everything valuable in my truck and double-checked that my hunting knife was within reach before zipping myself into my tent. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by sounds that might have been normal forest noises, or might have been someone moving around my campsite. Each time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, certain I'd heard footsteps circling my tent. By morning, I'd made my decision. Friendly Montana hospitality had its limits. I would break camp and find another site deeper in the wilderness, where unexpected visitors were less likely to find me. The pre-dawn light painted everything in shades of gray as I emerged from my tent. To my surprise, Darren's small campsite was already dismantled, no sign of him except for compressed grass where his tent had stood. Relief washed over me. Perhaps he'd sensed my discomfort and moved on. I made coffee and considered my options. Moving camp meant losing a day of hiking, but the thought of another night with unexpected visitors made the decision easy. I'd head northwest toward a small plateau I remembered from hunting trips years ago. It was accessible only by a faint game trail and offered excellent views of approaching visitors. By mid-morning, I had packed everything except my tent and was doing a final sweep of the campsite when I heard vehicle tires on the access road. I tensed, then relaxed when a familiar forest green Jeep appeared. Brett Holloway wasn't due for 2 more days, but his early arrival was welcome. "Dust," Brett called, climbing out with his characteristic grin. His solid 6-foot frame and booming voice always made him seem larger than he was. "Surprise? Got my projects wrapped early and thought I'd head up before the weather turns." I abandoned my plans to relocate and helped Brett unload his gear. Having a trusted friend in camp instantly dispelled my unease about the previous night's visitor. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Brett commented as we set up his tent. "Woods got you jumpy already?" I debated whether to mention Darren, then decided against it. In daylight, with Brett's reassuring presence, my concerns seemed overblown. "Just didn't sleep great. Had some wildlife circling camp last night." We spent the day hiking to a nearby waterfall, falling into the easy rhythm of old friendship. Brett talked about his latest carpentry project. I shared stories about Madeline's recent soccer victories. The normality was comforting, and by evening, Darren seemed like nothing more than a strange encounter to laugh about. Until we returned to camp and found everything destroyed. My tent had been slashed repeatedly, the fabric hanging in ribbons. Our coolers were upended, contents scattered. Brett's backpack had been emptied, his clothes flung into the surrounding brush. Most disturbing were the deep gouges in my truck's doors, straight lines clearly made by a blade, not animal claws. "What the hell?" Brett whispered, instinctively moving back to back with me as we surveyed the damage. "You think it's bears?" "No bear did this," I said, pointing pointing to the methodical slashes in my tent. This was deliberate. We searched the surrounding area carefully, finding no sign of the perpetrator. No footprints, no dropped items, just the deliberate destruction of our camp. "We should leave," Brett urged, already gathering what remained of his belongings. "Report this to the Rangers on our way out." I hesitated. It's probably that guy from last night, Darren. Seemed off, but I didn't think he'd do something like this. "All the more reason to go," Brett insisted. "This is serious, Dust. Someone's sending a message." As I reluctantly agreed, the setting sun gleamed on something metallic near the fire pit. I approached cautiously and felt my stomach drop. My hunting knife, which I was certain I'd packed in my day bag that morning, was stuck blade first into a log. Beneath it was a scrap of paper with 5 words scrawled in charcoal. "I'm still watching you, Dustin." Brett's face paled when I showed him. "We're leaving. Now." We hastily packed what we could salvage into my truck. As I turned the key, I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by shadows. Before I could point it out to Brett, it withdrew into the darkness. "Someone's out there," I said quietly, putting the truck in gear. Brett strained to see through the gathering darkness. "I don't see anything. Let's just go." The truck's headlights cut through the forest as we navigated the narrow access road. Each curve revealed only more trees, more shadows where someone could hide. The 3-mile drive to the main forest road felt interminable. We were nearly at the junction when the truck's engine suddenly sputtered and died. "This isn't happening," I muttered, turning the key again. The engine cranked but wouldn't catch. Brett immediately pulled out his phone, though we both knew there would be no service this deep in the forest. "Engine was fine on the drive in," I said, trying to keep the rising panic from my voice. I popped the hood and grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment. The beam revealed the problem immediately. The fuel line had been cleanly cut, a small puddle of gasoline still forming beneath the truck. This was no accident or mechanical failure. "Someone sabotaged us," I said, showing Brett the damage. "Recently, too. We're leaking fuel." Brett's normally jovial face hardened. "So they wanted us stranded out here. Question is, do we stay with the truck or hike out?" Night had fallen completely now, the darkness between trees absolute. The main road was still over 2 miles away, and from there it would be at least 15 miles to the ranger station or any hope of cell service. Staying put makes us easy targets, I reasoned. But hiking out means we're vulnerable and separated from whatever supplies we have left. After quick deliberation, we decided to gather essential supplies into our packs, hide the rest in the truck, and hike to the main road. From there, we'd reassess, possibly continuing to the ranger station or flagging down a passing vehicle. We moved swiftly and silently, flashlights pointed downward to preserve our night vision. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us pause, hearts hammering. The knowledge that someone was out there, watching and waiting, transformed the familiar forest into a labyrinth of potential threats. About half a mile from the truck, Brett suddenly grabbed my arm, stopping me in my tracks. He pointed silently to our left. Through the trees, barely visible, was the glow of a small fire. "Could be another camper," I whispered hopefully. Brett shook his head. "Nobody camps this far off trail, and after what happened..." We debated approaching, the possibility of help warring with the certainty of danger. Curiosity and desperation won out. We circled wide, approaching the light from downwind, moving with exaggerated care. The small clearing came into view gradually. A campfire burned low, illuminating a simple setup: a bedroll, a small pack, and some cooking equipment. No tent, no vehicle nearby. The camper was nowhere to be seen. "I don't like this," Brett whispered. "Feels like a trap." As if summoned by his words, a branch snapped behind us. We whirled, Brett raising his walking stick defensively. The beam of my flashlight caught movement between trees about 30 yards back, a human figure ducking out of sight. "Hey!" I called, abandoning stealth. "We know you're there!" Silence answered, heavy and threatening. Then a low laugh echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You boys lost?" The voice was unmistakably Darren's, but distorted somehow, filled with malicious amusement. "Truck trouble? What do you want?" I demanded, trying to pinpoint his location as Brett and I backed toward the fire. Just some company, Darren replied, closer now. Gets lonely out here. Thought we could spend some quality time together before your trip's over. The way he emphasized over sent ice through my veins. We're expected back tomorrow, Brett lied smoothly. People know where we are. Another laugh, this one closer to a giggle. No, they don't. You told your brother Wyatt you'd be gone 5 days. And Brett here, well, he wasn't supposed to arrive until the day after tomorrow. Nobody's looking for you yet. The realization that he knew our names, our plans, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. He'd been watching me, learning about me for who knows how long. The Rangers have our wilderness permit information, I countered, continuing to back toward the fire where we'd at least have visibility. Park rangers are busy with a missing hiker near Yellowstone, Darren said casually. Called in the report myself yesterday. Very convincing. We reached the fire, the small circle of light offering no real protection but at least eliminating some shadows. Brett positioned himself so we stood back to back, scanning the darkness. Show yourself, Brett demanded. What the hell do you want from us? I want to play a game, Darren replied, his voice now coming from a different direction entirely. It's called survival. Rules are simple. You run, I hunt. If you make it to the ranger station alive, you win. If not... He let the sentence hang unfinished. We're not playing your sick game, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. You already are, Darren whispered, suddenly much closer. The attack came with shocking speed. A figure lunged from the darkness directly at Brett, swinging something that flashed in the firelight. Brett managed to partially deflect the blow with his walking stick, but the impact knocked him sideways. I caught a glimpse of Darren's face, eyes wide with excitement, mouth stretched in a grotesque grin, before he disappeared again into the darkness. Brett stumbled, clutching his arm where blood already darkened his jacket sleeve. He's got an axe, he gasped. Game starts now, Darren called from somewhere in the darkness. I'll give you a 5-minute head start. Better use it wisely. We had no choice. Grabbing what supplies we could from around the fire, a water bottle, a small first aid kit, we plunged into the forest, heading roughly northeast toward where we believed the main road lay. The forest closed around us like a tomb. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran, the beam of my single flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of us. Brett's breath came in harsh gasps beside me, his injured arm clutched tight against his body. I had hastily wrapped it with a bandana, but blood was already soaking through. We need to find water, I panted as we paused behind a massive fallen tree. A stream or creek. It'll mask our trail and give us direction. Brett nodded grimly, his face pale in the dim light. There's a creek that feeds into Moose Creek about half a mile east. If we can reach it, we can follow it north to the main road. We moved more carefully now, trying to balance speed with silence. Every few minutes we'd pause to listen, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal animals. Just our labored breathing and the occasional snap of twigs beneath our boots. The ground began to slope downward, and soon we heard the faint gurgle of flowing water. Relief surged through me as we stumbled toward the sound. The creek was narrow but swift-moving, its black surface occasionally catching moonlight that filtered through the canopy. We need to treat your wound properly, I said, helping Brett to a sitting position on a rock by the water's edge. No time, Brett argued, wincing as I carefully removed the soaked bandana. He could be right behind us. The gash was deep but clean, running about 4 inches along his upper arm. Using the small first aid kit we'd grabbed, I cleaned and dressed it as best I could, finishing with a pressure bandage to slow the bleeding. It needs stitches, I said grimly. It needs us to survive the night, Brett countered, forcing himself to stand. Which way is north? I checked my watch compass. That way, following the creek downstream. We waded into the icy water, wincing at the cold but grateful for the protection it offered from leaving tracks. The creek bed was slippery with moss-covered rocks, forcing us to move slowly to avoid falls that could leave us even more vulnerable. After about 20 minutes of painful progress, a sound froze us in place, a distant sing-song voice carrying through the trees. Dustin. Brett. Where are my new friends hiding? Darren was following, and closer than we'd hoped. We pressed ourselves against the creek bank, trying to blend into the shadows as his voice grew gradually louder. "I'm disappointed in you boys," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the night air. "The creek, really? So predictable. Might as well have left a trail of breadcrumbs." A beam of light swept the trees about 100 yards behind us, moving methodically back and forth as Darren searched. We crouched lower in the water, the cold seeping into our bones but fear preventing any movement that might give us away. "Let me tell you what happens next," Darren continued conversationally, as if we were sitting around a campfire sharing stories. "Most people in your situation make one of two mistakes. They either exhaust themselves trying to outrun me all night, or they find what they think is a good hiding spot and stay put, hoping I'll pass them by." The light beam swung closer, illuminating the creek bed about 50 yards away. "The runners always collapse eventually. Hypothermia, exhaustion, or they injure themselves in the dark. The hiders?" He laughed. "They just make my job easier. Like shooting fish in a barrel." Brett gripped my arm, pointing silently to a narrow deer trail leading away from the creek on the opposite bank. It was a risk. Leaving the water meant leaving tracks, but staying put with Darren approaching was certain death. Moving with agonizing slowness to avoid splashing, we crossed to the far bank and crawled up the muddy slope. The undergrowth was dense enough to provide cover, but every movement seemed thunderously loud to my terrified ears. "I can smell your fear," Darren called, his light now playing across the spot we'd occupied just moments before. "The wounded always leave a scent." We froze, hardly daring to breathe as Darren's shadowy figure appeared at the creek's edge. He stood motionless, sweeping his light across the water, then up both banks. For a heart-stopping moment, the beam passed directly over our position, but the thick underbrush must have concealed us sufficiently. Darren waded into the creek, moving upstream rather than down. "Smart move," he muttered, just loud enough for us to hear. "But it only delays the inevitable." We remained motionless until his light disappeared around a bend in the creek. Only then did we continue along the deer trail, moving as quickly as we dared through the pitch-black forest, guided only by occasional glimpses of stars through the canopy. "He's toying with us," Brett whispered as we paused to rest in a small clearing. "He could have infrared night vision gear for all we know." "Why, though?" I asked, the question that had been burning since this nightmare began. "Why us? Why me?" Brett shook his head. "Some people don't need a reason, Dust, they're just wired wrong." As if to punctuate his statement, a scream tore through the night. Not human, but the shriek of an animal in mortal pain. It came from somewhere behind us in the direction Darren had gone. "He's killing something," Brett whispered, sending a message. We pushed on, the deer trail eventually widening into what appeared to be an old logging path. Our pace increased on the clearer ground, hope rising that we might actually reach the main road before dawn. That hope died as the path abruptly ended at a sheer rock face, a cliff stretching at least 60 feet upward with no obvious way around. We'd been following a box canyon, not a trail to freedom. Brett sagged against a tree, exhaustion and blood loss evident in his pale face. "We can't go back," he stated flatly. "He'll be waiting." I examined the cliff face in the dim light. "We climb," I decided, running my hands over the rock surface. "There are enough handholds. It's our only option." Brett looked dubiously at his injured arm, then at the imposing cliff. "You go," he said quietly. "Get help. I'll hide nearby and keep him occupied if he shows up." "No," I said firmly. "We stick together. I'll help you." The argument that followed was brief but intense, ended only by a sound that made our blood freeze. Darren's voice, much closer than should have been possible. "Found you." We spun toward the voice, backs against the cliff face. Darren stood at the mouth of the box canyon, his silhouette unmistakable in the faint moonlight. The distance between us, perhaps 50 yards, offered no comfort. In his right hand gleamed the axe, its edge catching what little light filtered through the trees. "Nowhere left to run," he observed casually, taking a deliberate step forward. "But I'll give you credit. You lasted longer than most." Brett straightened beside me, somehow finding reserves of strength. "What do you want from us?" he demanded. Darren tilted his head, considering the question as if it were genuinely interesting. I want to feel something, I suppose. Life gets so monotonous. But this, he gestured with the axe, this makes everything crystal clear. In these moments, I'm fully alive. And you are too, aren't you? More alive than you've ever been. He was insane. The realization brought strange clarity. There would be no reasoning with him, no appeal to humanity or mercy that would reach whatever broken thing existed inside him. We need to split up, I whispered to Brett, my eyes never leaving Darren's approaching figure. Give one of us a chance. Both of you die tonight, Darren called as if hearing my words. But I'm not unreasonable. I'll make a deal. Whoever reaches me first gets the quicker death. The other, he shrugged. Well, I like to take my time. Brett and I exchanged a glance, a lifetime of friendship condensed into one look. No words were needed. We both understood what had to happen, now. I shouted, and we bolted in opposite directions. Brett toward the left side of the canyon, me toward the right. The plan was desperate. Force Darren to choose which of us to pursue, giving the other a chance to circle behind him and escape back up the path. Darren hesitated only a moment before turning toward Brett, perhaps seeing him as the easier target due to his injury. I ran harder, aiming to circle wide through the trees and come up behind our pursuer. The forest floor was treacherous in the darkness, roots and rocks threatening to send me sprawling with each step. Behind me, I heard Brett shouting, drawing Darren's attention, buying me precious seconds. Then came sounds no one should ever have to hear. The meaty thunk of blade meeting flesh, a strangled cry cut horribly short. Grief and rage propelled me forward, but survival instinct kept me from turning back. Brett had made his choice. The best way to honor it was to escape, to ensure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. I reached the canyon entrance and hurtled up the path we descended earlier, no longer concerned with silence or tracking. Pure adrenaline drove me through the darkness, branches tearing at my face and clothes as I ran blindly forward. Behind me came crashing sounds, Darren pursuing at a run. He was no longer playing, no longer toying with his prey. The game had changed to simple predator and prey. You can't outrun me, Dustin, he called, his voice tight with excitement. Your friend died screaming. Want to know what his last words were? I blocked out his taunts, focusing solely on putting distance between us. The path began to climb steeply, my lungs burning with exertion. Ahead, through gaps in the trees, I caught glimpses of a steep ridge. If I could reach it, perhaps I could find a defensible position or a route too difficult for Darren to follow quickly. The trees thinned as I neared the ridge, moonlight suddenly illuminating the terrain. I realized too late it was a mixed blessing. I could see where I was going, but Darren could see me more easily as well. The ridge was steeper than I'd hoped, a near-vertical scramble of loose shale and stunted trees. I began climbing anyway, rocks slipping beneath my boots, hands grasping desperately for any solid hold. Running uphill? Darren laughed below me. Tiring yourself out? That's a new one. I didn't respond, saving my breath for the climb. About 20 feet up, I reached a narrow ledge, barely wide enough to stand on, but offering a moment's respite. Looking down, I saw Darren begin his own ascent, moving with the casual confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I couldn't outclimb him, couldn't outrun him. But perhaps my hand closed around a baseball-sized rock on the ledge. I waited, timing my move carefully as Darren climbed closer. When he was about 10 feet below, I hurled the rock with all my strength, aiming for his head. He jerked sideways with inhuman speed, but the rock still caught him on the shoulder, sending him sliding several feet down the shale slope. He recovered quickly, a new emotion crossing his face, anger replacing the playful bloodlust. First one to draw blood, he acknowledged, rotating his shoulder. But that's all you get. I scrambled higher as he resumed his pursuit, searching desperately for any advantage the terrain might offer. The ridge continued upward for perhaps another 100 feet, the top lost in darkness. No way to know what waited above, possible escape or a dead end even worse than the box canyon. Halfway up, disaster struck. A handhold I'd trusted crumbled under my weight, sending me tumbling backward. I slid several yards down the loose shale before managing to arrest my fall by digging my fingers into the soil. Pain shot through my left ankle, not broken but certainly sprained. Darren's laugh floated up from below. Gravity's a bitch, isn't it? Stay put, I'll be right there. Desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I hauled myself upward, putting minimal weight on my injured ankle, moving on pure will alone. The ridge steepened further, forcing me to climb more than walk. Every movement sent waves of agony through my leg, but stopping meant death. Just as my strength began to fail, my hand grasped what felt like a tree root. But it was too straight, too smooth. A rope? I pulled myself up further and discovered an old climbing rope anchored to a metal spike driven deep into the rock. Someone had established a route here perhaps years ago. Hope surged as I tested the rope. It held firm despite obvious weathering. Using it to assist my climb, I made faster progress up the increasingly vertical face. Below, Darren had noticed my discovery and was pushing harder to close the gap between us. The rope led upward into what appeared to be a narrow cleft in the ridgeline. As I pulled myself into it, my flashlight revealed what I'd found. Not a natural feature, but the remains of an old mining operation. A horizontal shaft extended into the ridge, timber supports creating a low tunnel barely tall enough to stand in. Without hesitation, I entered the mine shaft, moving as quickly as my injured ankle allowed. The air grew stale and cold, the beam of my flashlight illuminating rusty tools and rotting support beams. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead, the sound echoing ominously. I paused about 20 feet in, listening intently. Scrabbling sounds from the entrance told me Darren had reached the rope and was following. A plan, desperate and dangerous, formed in my mind. Switching off my flashlight, I pressed myself against the wall of the tunnel, watching the entrance. Soon Darren's silhouette appeared, backlit by the faint pre-dawn sky. "Clever," he called into the darkness. "But mines have no exit, Dustin. You've trapped yourself." He flicked on his own light, the beam sweeping the tunnel as he cautiously entered. I remained motionless, barely breathing as he moved past my position. When he was about 10 feet beyond me, I made my move. Lunging forward, I grabbed one of the support beams and pulled with all my remaining strength. Years of decay had done their work. The timber cracked and gave way, bringing down a section of the tunnel ceiling. Earth and rock cascaded between us as I turned and sprinted toward the entrance, ignoring the screaming pain in my ankle. Behind me, Darren roared in fury as he realized what I'd done. I didn't look back, didn't stop to see if the collapse had trapped him or merely delayed him. The shaft entrance appeared ahead, gray dawn light beckoning like salvation. I burst out onto the ridge, the cool morning air filling my lungs. The eastern sky was lightening, silhouetting the mountains with the promise of sunrise. Looking down the way I'd come, I could see for miles, including, in the far distance, what had to be the main forest road winding through the valley. No time to celebrate. I began descending the ridge on the opposite side from where we'd climbed, using trees and shrubs to control my speed. Each step on my injured ankle was agony, but the alternative, waiting for Darren to dig his way out or find another exit, was unthinkable. The descent was treacherous, but gravity worked in my favor now. Within 20 minutes, I reached the valley floor, the terrain leveling into dense forest once more. My pace slowed, exhaustion and injury taking their toll, but I pushed onward in the direction I believed would lead to the road. A sound from behind stole what little hope I'd mustered. Distant but distinct, Darren's voice calling my name. Impossibly, he had escaped the mine collapse and was on my trail once more. The realization should have crushed my spirit, but instead a strange calm settled over me. I had been running for hours, fear driving me beyond normal human endurance. There would be no more running. The forest opened into a small meadow, early morning mist clinging to the tall grass. At the center stood a massive Douglas fir, its lower branches creating a natural shelter. I limped toward it, an idea forming. Not a plan for escape, but for confrontation. This would end here one way or another. I gathered fallen branches as I approached the tree, piling them strategically. From my pack, I retrieved my last resources: a small bottle of alcohol-based hand sanitizer, a lighter, and my Swiss Army knife. Poor weapons against an axe-wielding maniac, but they were all I had. Darren's voice grew closer as I finished my preparations, ducking beneath the fir's lower branches to wait. His taunts had taken on a new edge, frustration mixing with the sadistic pleasure that had dominated earlier. "You're only making it worse for yourself," he called, close enough now that I could hear twigs snapping beneath his boots. I was going to be merciful, quick, now I'm angry. The morning light strengthened, burning away some of the mist as Darren emerged at the meadow's edge. He looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, yet no less terrifying. Blood stained his clothing, Brett's blood, and dirt covered him from the mine collapse. The axe hung loosely in his right hand, its blade notched and dark with dried blood. He paused at the meadow's perimeter, scanning the open space with predatory focus. I remained motionless beneath the tree, watching through gaps in the branches. He hadn't spotted me yet, but it was only a matter of time. "I know you're close," he said, his voice deceptively conversational. "I can smell the blood from your ankle. Does it hurt, Dustin? It's going to hurt a lot more soon." He began circling the meadow, moving with the patience of someone who knew his prey was cornered. I tensed, fingers tightening around my knife. The blade was painfully inadequate against his axe, but surprise might give me a momentary advantage. As he approached my position, I squeezed a generous amount of hand sanitizer onto the pile of branches I'd arranged, then flicked the lighter. The alcohol caught immediately, flames leaping higher as they spread to the dry wood. "What the?" Darren spun toward the sudden blaze, momentarily distracted. I erupted from beneath the tree, launching myself at him with every ounce of strength remaining in my battered body. The impact knocked us both to the ground, my knife slashing wildly. I felt it connect, heard Darren's howl of pain as the blade sliced across his forearm. The victory was short-lived. He recovered with frightening speed, bucking me off and scrambling to his feet. My ankle gave way as I tried to stand, sending me crashing back to the ground. The knife flew from my grasp, landing in the tall grass several feet away. That, Darren said, touching the bleeding gash on his arm, was exceptionally stupid. He raised the axe, eyes glittering with rage and anticipation. I rolled desperately as the axe swung downward, the blade burying itself in the earth where my head had been seconds before. Darren wrenched it free, advancing as I scrabbled backward on hands and knees. "Your friend died quickly," he said, swinging again and missing by inches as I continued my desperate retreat. "A luxury you forfeited." My back hit the trunk of the Douglas fir, nowhere left to go. Darren loomed over me, axe raised for the killing blow, his face split in a grotesque grin of triumph. The sound that saved me was so ordinary, so out of place in our life-or-death struggle, that we both froze in confusion. A car engine followed by voices, human voices carrying clearly through the morning air. "Over here! I see smoke." Darren's head whipped toward the sound, his expression morphing from sadistic pleasure to animal fear. The Forest Service road must have been closer than I'd realized, and my fire had drawn attention. "This isn't over," he hissed, backing away. "We'll finish our game another time." He turned and sprinted toward the far side of the meadow, disappearing into the tree line just as shouts grew louder from the opposite direction. I collapsed against the tree, consciousness fading as figures emerged from the forest, uniformed forest rangers, weapons drawn, running toward my position. The last thing I remembered was a woman's face hovering over mine, her voice urgent but distant as darkness claimed me. "Stay with me, sir. Ambulance is on the way. You're safe now." But I wasn't safe. Not really. Not while Darren remained free. I woke to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell confirming I had survived. My body felt distant, pain dulled by what I assumed were powerful medications. A bandaged arm appeared in my peripheral vision, not mine, but belonging to someone seated beside the bed. "Wyatt?" My voice emerged as a croak. My brother jolted upright, relief washing over his haggard face. "Dust, thank God." He fumbled for a call button. "The doctor said you'd wake up today, but after 3 days. 3 days. The words felt wrong in my mouth, disconnected from reality. A nurse appeared, followed shortly by a doctor who performed a brief examination, asking simple questions to assess my condition. When they left, promising to return soon, Wyatt filled in the gaps in my memory. "The Forest Service found you Thursday morning. Couple of rangers on routine patrol saw your fire. You were in bad shape. Dehydration, exposure, that ankle's got 3 torn ligaments, but you'll recover fully." "Brett?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the grief in Wyatt's eyes. "They found him late Thursday, down in a canyon about 2 miles from where they found you." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Dust." The door opened again, admitting 2 unfamiliar figures, a tall, stern-faced woman in a sheriff's uniform and a shorter man in plain clothes who immediately produced a badge. "Mr. Yersom," the man said. "I'm Detective Holt, Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. This is Sheriff Callahan. We need to ask you some questions about what happened in Moose Creek if you're up to it." I nodded, the movement sending dull pain through my skull. "Did you catch him, Darren?" The officers exchanged glances. "We've been searching the area since Thursday," Sheriff Callahan said. "No sign of anyone matching the description you gave the Rangers before you lost consciousness." "He's still out there," I whispered, cold fear slicing through the medication's haze. "We need you to tell us everything," Detective Holt said, pulling out a recorder. "Start from the beginning." I recounted the entire nightmare, meeting Darren at my campsite, the destruction of our camp, the pursuit through the forest, Brett's sacrifice, the mine shaft, and the final confrontation in the meadow. As I spoke, Detective Holt took notes while Sheriff Callahan's expression grew increasingly troubled. When I finished, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, Detective Holt cleared his throat. "Mr. Yersom, we've checked regional databases for anyone matching your description of this Darren. Nothing. No fingerprints at your campsite except yours and Mr. Holloway's. No evidence of a third person at all." "What are you saying?" Wyatt demanded, his protective instincts flaring. "You think my brother made this up?" "Of course not," Sheriff Callahan intervened smoothly. "But trauma can affect memory. The medical examiner believes Mr. Holloway's wounds are consistent with a wildlife attack, possibly a mountain lion or bear." The implication hit me like a physical blow. "You think an animal killed Brett? That's insane. I saw Darren attack him. I saw the axe." "A physical examination showed you had a significant concussion," Detective Holt noted, his tone professionally neutral. "Along with severe sleep deprivation and the beginning stages of hypothermia, all of which can cause hallucinations or distorted perceptions." I struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain that knifed through various parts of my body. "Then explain the destroyed campsite. Explain the cuts on my truck. Explain how I ended up miles from where we were camping if we were attacked by an animal." "We've seen bizarre behavior from injured hikers before," Sheriff Callahan said gently. "Disorientation, paranoia. People can travel remarkable distances in survival mode, even with serious injuries." The conversation continued in this vein for another 30 minutes, with the officers asking detailed questions that seemed designed to expose inconsistencies in my account. They were polite, even sympathetic, but their skepticism was palpable. When they finally left, promising to continue the investigation, Wyatt exploded. "Unbelievable. They think you imagined the whole thing." "They think I'm crazy," I corrected quietly. "Or that the trauma scrambled my memories." "What about the guy you described? This Darren character?" I shook my head. "If they haven't found any evidence he exists..." My voice trailed off as a horrible possibility formed in my mind. What if they were right? What if my concussed hypothermic brain had constructed an elaborate narrative to explain a simple, tragic wildlife encounter? The human mind was capable of extraordinary self-deception when faced with trauma. But no, the memories were too vivid, too consistent. I remembered Darren's voice, his words, the methodical way he had hunted us. No animal could have slashed my tent with such precision or carved those deliberate gouges in my truck. In the weeks that followed, I was released from the hospital and began the slow process of physical recovery. Brett's funeral was a blur of grief and guilt. His parents were gracious, absolving me of responsibility for their son's death, which somehow made the burden heavier. The official investigation concluded that Brett Holloway had been killed by a wildlife attack, most likely a mountain lion. My contradictory account was attributed to trauma-induced confabulation, a clinical term that essentially meant my brain had invented a human attacker to make sense of a random animal encounter. I tried to accept this explanation, to embrace the closure it offered. Life would be simpler if I believed Darren had never existed. But at night, alone in my apartment with the lights on and doors triple locked, I knew the truth. 2 months after the attack, a small package arrived at my door. No return address, no postmark. Someone had hand-delivered it. Inside was a single item, my hunting knife, the one I'd lost in the meadow during our final confrontation. Attached was a note containing 3 words in an unfamiliar handwriting: "Game not over." I reported it to Detective Holt, who took the package for evidence testing but called the next day with predictable results. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to connect it to any known suspect. He suggested kindly but firmly that I consider therapy for post-traumatic stress. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps professional help was the answer. But as I stared at the business card for the recommended therapist, another thought formed, a thought that would eventually become an obsession. If the authorities wouldn't believe me, if they couldn't or wouldn't find Darren, then the responsibility fell to me. He was out there, perhaps watching me even now, waiting to resume his game. Next time, I would be ready. I opened my laptop and began researching. Missing persons in national forests, unsolved deaths in wilderness areas, patterns that might reveal the hunting grounds of a predator who had evaded detection for who knows how long. The screen glowed in my darkened apartment as names and faces appeared. Hikers, campers, solo travelers who had ventured into remote areas and never returned. How many of them had encountered Darren? How many had died believing help would come, not knowing they were merely pawns in his twisted game? Outside, the October wind rattled my windows as the first snow of the season began to fall. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, a killer waited, and I had become the hunter.